LXXXX, A Friendly Meeting, Part 1. AC 300, Yunkai, Dragon's Bay, Essos. Sansa Stark. Daenerys Targaryen was not quite what Sansa expected. It seemed almost impossible, this slight, frail woman being the terror of Essos. The mother of dragons, the Khaleesi, whose exploits had even made their way to King's Landing. Though at the time, she had a lot of other things on her mind. Still, she'd imagined a tall, intimidating warrior woman, someone like Daisy Mormont. Not a girl she was actually taller than. A girl who had invited her to tea, of all things. Iced tea. In a pleasant solar, well-shaded and well-ventilated. She didn't even have any guards on her. The slight blonde woman sipped her tea, and smiled at her. I hope you like it. Some of the northern engineers showed us how to make small amounts of ice. Digging pits in the sand, covering them with tarp. It really is quite fascinating, don't you agree? Yes, very fascinating, Sansa said with a slight nod. We just got ice from. Well, various places in the north, she said. I can't even conceive of a place that cold, Daenerys said. She shook her head in mild disbelief. What is it like? Sansa frowned. Was this an attempt to learn about the north? Any defenses? Technologies? What could she know? She wouldn't know anything useful, she had to know that. Unless Daenerys didn't know she did, or knew she didn't know or... It's hard to describe, she said diplomatically. I suppose it is, Daenerys allowed. She smiled softly, studying her. Sansa studied her right back. They sat in silence for a time. Daenerys set her tea down, and sighed. Well, now that the pleasantries are over, the Dragon Queen said, I suppose we should get to the core of things, shouldn't we? You feel that you've traded one prison for another, don't you? Sansa slowly nodded. I don't feel. I know. How did you come here, anyway? Daenerys asked. I mean, the specific details. Sansa sighed. It was an experience, she admitted. Her quarters were little more than a cell. She supposed it was better than having to share quarters with Cersei. How the rest of the crew stood her without wanting to throw her overboard, she would never know. Especially with her drinking and ranting as they braved the seas. She had watched from the deck as the green flames began to consume King's Landing. She had hoped beyond hope that one of the northern warships would see them, but they hadn't. They had just slipped away, into the dark night, as the flames rose into the sky. They wouldn't see her. They wouldn't be rescuing her. A fact that Cersei had gloated over eagerly in the stateroom after. It took every ounce of her strength not to stab her with her dinner knife. The guards with Cersei stood in silent menace and utter obedience. Some of the Unsullied, she recalled. They didn't smile, or speak. They just stood there, like steelwork dolls. Even the crew, for all their mixed emotions, wouldn't cross them. As a result, she was taking care of Tommen. He was understandably frightened, the little boy. She had never felt any resentment towards him, he'd had to put up with Joffrey far more than her. They shared that pain. They shared their fear. All they could do was stay together, weather the waves, sleep in the same bunk, holding each other. There was nothing else. It was here, under a filthy blanket, that she knew the price for saving Arya. It was here that she let herself cry, hidden by the creaking of the timbers, the wind in the sails. Then came the third night on the sea. The sound of thunder broke, and Sansa shivered with Tommen clinging to her, then came more cracks of thunder. Faster. Cries of pain from the crew, and the shouts of men. Sansa's eyes widened, her heart beating in time with the shots. What? What is it? Tommen whispered. Sansa felt a smile on her face, for what felt like the first time in forever. Gunfire, she whispered. She pushed Tommen down to the deck, and dragged herself across to the hatch. She peeked out, staying low. Yes. Green light in the dark hallway. Flares? She knew their shape and color from all the times Theon had shown them off. In here. Please, help us. She shouted. Please. Help us. She felt someone knock on the hatch, and she knocked back hard with her fist. An answering knock made her grin. Yes. In here. She shouted again. There was a harder knock on the door, and Sansa could see the teeth of a crowbar being forced into the crack between it and the bulkhead. She slid back, wrapping an arm around Tommen. What? What if the Northerners? Tommen muttered. Sansa shook her head. I won't let them hurt you. I promise, she said. The hatch came loose with a loud crack and splintering, revealing two men holding green flares. They were dressed in dark cloaks, with tall boots. Both were bald with tattoos across their bare scalps. Tommen squeaked, but Sansa just smiled. I am Lady Sansa Stark. Sorry, Princess Sansa Stark, she said. Please, take me to your captain. The two men looked at each other, then back to Sansa. They nodded, and stepped back. They motioned to the left and Sansa and Tommen slowly rose. They stumbled a bit, but got out of the room and headed down the hallway. The two sailors followed, still silent. Sansa didn't know why, but she didn't care. Northerners. They were saved. They made it to the deck, where a clear sky filled with glittering stars greeted her. And there, shining in the waning moon's light, were the sails of a northern schooner. A small one, to be sure, but she had never seen another ship like it. The crew was being held by more of the sailors in dark cloaks. And then came the most beautiful sight of all. Unhand me. I am the Queen of Westeros. I'll have your cocks cut off and forced down your throats. Cersei shrieked, bound in rope before a tall, long-haired man in a black cloak. He wore an eye patch, over a handsome roguish face. One that put Sansa in mind of someone familiar. Theon? She thought. No, this man was older. Quite a mouth on you, your grace, he said, perfectly pleasant. He looked over at Sansa, and smiled. Damn. Aren't you a gorgeous one? Sansa began. Still, she'd put up with worse. She wouldn't. What was the phrase? Look a gift horse in the mouth? What did that even mean? Thank you, kind captain. May I ask for your name? Euron Greyjoy, the man said with a grin and a bow, King of the Iron Isles, and you're my prisoner. Sansa blinked. Euron Greyjoy blinked a few times, and then shook his head. I mean, I'm rescuing you. Yes, that is what I meant, he said with a nod. Strangely, she was still reminded of Theon. But the unhealthy glint in the man's eyes gave her reason to be worried. Still, she'd approach it with tact and decorum. Like any invention of her foster brother's. Something that might explode. So. I can return home then, your grace? Sansa asked politely. Euron smiled. All in good time, for now. I think she needs a bit of behavior adjustment. And by behavior adjustment, I mean smacking her around. What do you all think? He asked both crews. Both his crew and the ship's crew seemed to like this, even as Cersei screeched again. Euron nodded, smiling in an incredibly cheerful way. Okay. Euron smacked her across the face, sending Cersei to the deck. He then kicked her. Sansa felt someone sob into her chest, and she looked down at Tommen. He was crying, clutching at her. Sansa looked up, as Euron continued to kick Cersei. She winced. Your grace? Perhaps you shouldn't do that in front of Queen Cersei's son. Sansa suggested. Euron immediately stopped, and looked over at her curiously. So I should do it behind closed doors? He asked. He shrugged. Well. Anything for a princess, right? Lads. Bring her on board. You stinking filth. You'll all lose your heads in. And someone? Kindly gag her. Euron asked. One of his men proceeded to tie a strip of cloth around her mouth, leaving the queen to whimper and screech, albeit very muffled. Euron stared intently at Sansa, which made her feel more than a little uncomfortable. And the princess, would you join me in my stateroom? Euron asked, trying to smile and looking like he was having difficulty doing it without pain. Sansa very slowly nodded. Of course, your grace. Just what had she gotten into now? See, a friendly meeting, part 2. AC 300, Yunkai, Dragon's Bay, Essos. Sansa Stark. The captain's cabin on board Euron's ship was quite spacious. Sansa was reminded of the Lady Lyanna back in White Harbor. She'd attended the christening with her father and Theon. The first ship of the new Navy of the North. Her father had christened the ship himself, breaking a bottle of Whitehill rum against the prow. She could still remember being there, the smell of the sea air, the roar of the crowd, the creaking of the timbers. She'd been so young. And yet it still hung in her memory like a perfect photograph on the wall. Beautiful, isn't she? Euron asked. Sansa started. Her mind had been drifting. The reminders of home were just so strong. She took a deep breath, and fought back tears. Tears she had held back for what felt like an eternity. Your vessel is quite impressive, she said diplomatically. She looked around the stateroom. It was bare, save for some maps and instruments. It really did not seem the type of dwelling for an infamous iron-born lord. Euron just grinned, his eye shining in the lamplight, as he reached out and cupped her cheek. She sucked in a deep breath. Wasn't talking about the ship, he murmured, baring his teeth like a wolf. Sansa stiffened, began to pull away as he leaned in, his breath heavy with a strange scent. And then his eyes widened, and he smacked the side of his head as though forgetting something important. Ah. Right, sorry, forgot, he said with a nod, pulling back. Forgot. What? Sansa asked, mystified. Euron shrugged and tilted his head. I'm not fucking you. That's what I forgot. He said cheerfully. Sansa's jaw dropped and her cheeks flared red. What? Nothing personal. In fact, under other circumstances I would be banging you cross-eyed over my desk, Euron said. He turned to his desk and grinned, hands on his hips. In fact, that is the only reason I got a desk for my room on this ship. Well, that and meetings. Wouldn't do to have everyone hold their meat and bread. Well, I suppose you could hold your meat, but, oops. Sorry, there I go again. Euron turned back to Sansa, still grinning. Sansa was, understandably, quite confused and a little frightened. I'm sorry. Sansa tried. Euron smacked himself again. Sorry. Right. That's a new word. For me. Trying to figure out how best to use it, when to. I've offended you, correct? Should I say sorry for wanting to fuck you? Or just talking about it? Euron inquired. Sansa was left blinking, and she was uncomfortably reminded of Theon when he was on a roll. I apologize for the disrespectful words. Sansa tried. Euron nodded. Right. I should do that. After all. I'm not stealing my nephew's girl. That would be. He tilted his head, like a confused puppy. Rude. Sansa, again wondering what she had done to warrant these kinds of things in her life, just slowly nodded. Euron grinned and clapped. Yes, see? That is the other reason I kidnapped you. I mean, rescued. Totally rescued. Your Grace, I'm sure my brother the king would reward you handsomely for rescuing me, Sansa emphasized, feeling quite cross now. Euron nodded. You're probably right. But. And just go with me on this one. What if in addition to rescuing you, I did a whole lot of other things to endear him to me? Euron grinned. He'd reward me even more, right? I think you could name your price with what you currently have. Sansa suggested. Euron spun around, and shook his head. No, that just won't do. I mean, I'm already on another errand, I'm picking up a beautiful lady with dragons for my wife. Already committed to it. Euron again tilted his head, staring at Sansa's shoulder. At this point, I can't really turn around. And how disappointing would that be? I just rescue you, deliver you to your brother, and happily ever after. He rapidly shook his head. No. That will not do. Not at all. Sansa had the feeling she was once again putting up with a madman. So she took a deep breath, and counted to 10. It was something her mother would do when Robb, Jon, and Theon's antics had gotten her ruffled once more. So I am, in effect, your hostage, Sansa said. Euron stared at her. Sansa continued, which means you aren't rescuing me, merely kidnapping me. Ah, but there is a difference. Euron said with an eager nod. And that is? Sansa prompted. Euron hummed. I'm not going to harm you. He asked. Sansa stared. Isn't that the main difference? No, Sansa stated, almost growling in frustration. Euron sighed. All right. So. To rescue you, what do I need to do? Are you being sarcastic? Sansa asked, finally exasperated enough to just let loose. Euron blinked. No. I'm pretty sure if I was being that, I'd say something like, of course I'm not going to ravish you and take you for my salt wife. And I wouldn't enjoy it at all, either. That would be sarcasm, Euron said with a sage nod. Sansa stared in disbelief. So. You're actually going to return me to my brother at some point, yes? Sansa asked. Euron nodded eagerly. Oh, absolutely. That's definitely in the plan. I am not being sarcastic. I am also going to wed you to my beloved nephew. Sansa flushed. What? Well, what's wrong with him? Euron asked flatly. There's someone better for you? I'm sure your mother would approve. Would she approve? It just seems like something people say, so I. Completely disregarding that, Sansa said evenly, you seem a bit. Off. Euron nodded, and held up a small potted plant. Sansa immediately recognized it, a tiny weirwood sapling. Oh. Well, you have to understand, I've had a revelation, Euron said. A religious vision. A fit, of you, something to change my entire viewpoint on all of reality, so I'm a little out of sorts. He shrugged. It had something to do with this tree. Ahoy, Sansa said slowly. Euron nodded. Yes. I was invoking some magics I learned off of. You know, it doesn't matter. Point is. When I invoked it with this tree. I saw. His eyes widened. Everything. Sansa asked softly, gazing at the tree. She didn't know why, but somehow. She felt the honesty in his words. Everything. A revelation, Euron said with a nod. And in this revelation, I realized. He set the pot down reverently, that I needed to rescue you, marry Daenerys, and do a few other things. Things I'm not completely sure about. But I know. I know I must do them. He looked at Sansa with shining eyes. I see, Sansa said with a nod. She sighed. If you will allow me a few conditions, while I am your guest, then I might be able to help. Really? Euron asked, almost childlike in his delight. I was going to ask you about that, given it's a weirwood tree and you're a Stark, but, lovely. I don't have to torture you for it. Yes, Sansa said stiffly, that is lovely. Daenerys stared in some disbelief at Sansa. The young Stark looked down at her drink, the ice long ago dissolved. So. He's insane, then, Daenerys said. Sansa nodded. Probably, she said, holding back a few suspicions of her own. She didn't know if she could trust this Daenerys, but sowing mistrust between her captors seemed the wisest move. Daenerys sighed. Well then. I suppose all that remains is to invite Theon Greyjoy to us, she smiled. After all. Opening diplomatic relations is my goal. Will you help me with that, Sansa? Of course, Khaleesi, Sansa said, forcing a smile. Why shouldn't I? Help other people keeping you captive? Daenerys asked wryly. Sansa frowned, and Daenerys smiled back mirthlessly. Believe me. At this point? I know full well how it feels. Oh. Sansa looked out the window of the palace, to the distant bay. A bay that was still close enough she could make out numerous ships, flying red Kraken flags. Oh. Yes. I suppose you do. Indeed, Daenerys said dryly. Sansa looked at the Dragon Queen with new eyes. She couldn't bring herself to fully trust her. Indeed, there was still no guarantee she wouldn't betray her to escape her situation entirely. At least for the moment though. She had an ally again. The game has changed. 1. AC 300, Stonehenge. Triumph of the Wolves. Raising a glass at the picture of the triumphant army taking King's Landing, he turned to his companion, enjoying his smile as he saw the cover. So the war is over, uncle. I, Hendry, his grace, and the men of the North and the Trident have defeated the Lannisters. Our people are avenged and peace has once again returned to our land. Placing the latest issue of the Despoiler on the table for his nephew to enjoy, he stood and vainly tried to ignore the jolts and aches of pain in every twist. This would be his last war, that he was sure of. Even as he could hear the celebrations among the small folk from the window, he could not shake the feeling of melancholy. Forgive me, uncle, I'm sorry, Lord Bracken, but you do not look particularly happy about it. I am ecstatic about the news, nephew. The Lannisters burned my home, Gregor Clegane raped its woman, they burned my fields and killed my men. They partook in incest, slavery, and had the gall to break guest right to feed their malicious greed and pride. My only regret was I unable to see the looks of defeat on the Lannisters' eyes as the last of their soldiers knelt and died against the young wolf. My uncertainty, however, makes me feel rather queer for the future. Are we not to be rewarded for our service, tolls and spoils from the Westerlands and the crown? Indeed, his grace has already saw fit to arrange a marriage between my daughter Jane and Sir Kyle of House Condon. With the death of House Went, quite a significant amount of land sworn to Harrenhal is to be parcelled. With Lady Catelyn almost surely having Prince Rickon take the Golden Tooth in the future as his seat, I am sure there will be even more opportunity in the West. But it is the work of Theon Greyjoy which troubles me, of what it means and what it will do. Hoping to shake his poor humour, he turned back to the Despoiler. This railroad the Reeds had developed was fascinating and had contributed heavily to the final defeat of the Lannisters. Yet with such metal beasts, what use would the mighty stallions of House Bracken be in the future? The Thunder Arms are a miracle from the gods, they allowed us to crush the lions. We lost less than a score of men when we returned to retake it after River Run. Thunder Arms, chemicals, trains, everything was different, so many new dangers and spectres to his land, to his neighbours. They did, but they changed how we fought, how we will fight, and more importantly who can fight. I see the power of bullets and I can only look upon the Red Fork and see nothing but horror and death. Memories of the Battle of River Run danced through his gaze, the finest knights of the Westerlands slaughtered like cattle upon the advance of Stark, Umber, Manderley and Bolton. The screams of the levies as the shrapnel from the cannons tore them limb from limb. The look upon the face of Tito's Blackwood as his son Lucas cheered at the deaths and their victory. The Blackwoods? You fear Tito's will have us all killed? King Robb would never allow such a thing. Tito's will not, nor will his children, but perhaps a cousin, a bastard, or even a member of the small folk. Thousands of years, hundreds of truces and betrayals, and our feuds have never stopped. With guns and rifles I am confident the next conflict will not end in anything else but a bloodbath. A lone farmer with a good eye with his weapon could murder the entire line of House Bracken and we would never see him coming. Theon Greyjoy has made the honor and institution of chivalry a dying animal, and we have only begun to feel its effects. Things will need to be changed, I will need to change. Looking upon the Red Fork, he was suddenly struck with inspiration. Mayhaps there was a future after all. My lord. Contact Riverrun, Sigurd, Fairmarket, and Raventree Hall, tell them I have an idea. Tell them it is time for old feuds to be buried once and for all. The game has changed, too. Riverrun 300 AC. The room was less than he hoped in truth. He wished for Ed Muir-Tully, Tiddos Blackwood, and Jason Mallister. What he received was the Lady Catelyn, Lucas Blackwood, and young Patrick Mallister with the addition of Carl Vance. Granted, Lady Catelyn and the addition of the latter house may make the proposal easier. Thank you for coming. I know this is sudden and the fallout from the War of Five Kings is still fresh in our minds, but I have a matter of great importance to discuss. One that will ensure the North and the Trident maintain our seat of power in Westeros for the future. You have never been a man to act without thinking, Lord Bracken, please enlighten us. Never one to forget her courtesies, he made sure to stay attentive of Lady Catelyn's demeanor. The Reeds and Searwins were die-hard supporters of House Stark, and a single raven or rider with the words of this one Tully could stop his plans instantly. I propose we start a company of the Commonwealth, a crown corporation as it were, to build a railroad from the port of Sigurd to Tumbler Falls. The proposed route would ensure steady trade through the core of our holdings and allow us to quickly move men and supplies in the event of a future conflict. The obvious monetary incentives will pay for the project in time. My proposed plan would start at Sigurd, as the most southern port of King Rob's holdings. Its status as a military base would have seen such a project constructed eventually. You are correct, despite our considerable victory over the Ironborn, money has already been set aside to expand it in the future. No more will we have to waste time and money on reavers. My father had even broached the idea of a new road from Sigurd to the King's Road in the east. This would be a more beneficial option. Indeed, the next part would travel south through Oldstone and into Fairmarket. Lucas stirred at the news, obviously understanding. Hence why you need House Blackwood. Go on, Lord Bracken, I must admit I am intrigued. Nodding, he decided not to push with the young Blackwood and come back to him for last. From Fairmarket we would turn south through the lands of my own house and into those of House Vance. At that point we would end the line at the Blackwater Rush, where more traditional means of transportation would take over, one that would allow trade from the Cape of Eagles all the way to the capital. Lord Vance caressed his brow rapidly, clearly trying to gather his thoughts. The cost of this may indeed pay for itself, but it will be considerable both in coin and men. Frankly, I do not see why we need Fairmarket. We could simply have the line go through the Blackwood Vale and straight to the Red Fork. I am aware, but we would lose out on the crops and materials of the town. One I might add is growing every day thanks to the new technologies of Lord Greyjoy. Besides, Fairmarket gives us access to fertile grounds between the Green and Blue Forks without having to deal with the frays. What of the railroad in the north? Will it not come down south through the neck? He smiled at the words of young Patrek. This at least he had planned for. Almost surely, but it will follow the King's Road all the way to the Crownlands. The rocks and trees along the path are already mostly taken care of. The Northmen are nothing if not practical, and they will save quite a bit of coin that way. Lady Catelyn smiled, clearly agreeing with his statement. And the fact Lord Valder will see the use of his tolls drop dramatically when the roads are finished never crossed your mind. Chuckles filled the room at Lucas's comment. All too much they had to listen to the damned weasels. I do not do this for the Freys or even the Riverlands. I propose this plan because it will ensure our future. By being the first to lay down these tracks we will be what everyone else must plan around. It just so happens, my lords, our route becomes so critical for Westeros. Tell me, when the Vale bends the knee to King Rob and sees the power of its technology, what will they do? Gain it for themselves, of course. Like the Andal's knowledge of steel, eventually all of Westeros will have it. True, but this new era of industry needs far more to function than a good and knowledgeable smith. It will need supplies, minerals, people, and most of all the infrastructure to transport it from the Sunset Sea to the Narrow Sea. The Trident Railroad Company, of whatever we decide to call it, will already have the expertise and tracks to work with. You will likely have to deal with House Reed and House Searwyn for this to work, Lord Bracken. What you hope to build they already have. I am aware, Lady Catelyn. I propose we create a council representing the houses of Searwyn, Reed, Mallister, Blackwood, Bracken, and Vance, alongside a seat for House Stark or Tully to oversee the business and share in its profits. One lesson this war has taught me is no single family can hope to live long surrounded with enemies holding a gun. We need a new way of doing things in Westeros, one where the institution will persist long after we die. Given the location of the Riverlands, any future railroad from the Westerlands would need to move east, would it not? Indeed, Lord Blackwood, and undoubtedly further lines would be constructed for the Viprens, Pipers, and Derrys in the future. What we must do this now if we hope to be ahead of the curve, as Lord Greyjoy would say. The room grew quiet as he made his final remarks, each individual evidently deep in thought. The magnitude of what they were attempting was unheard of in Westeros, perhaps only equaled by Brandon the Builder when he thought to construct the wall. You have the support of House Vance, Lord Bracken. House Mallister will support this endeavor as well. I wonder if it may be too large a hill to climb, but I cannot deny what it will do for our people. You have the provisional support of House Stark and House Tully. For obvious reasons I cannot confirm either until my brother and my son give their formal decree. I will however personally write to Sir Wyn and Greywater Watch with my wishes and your proposal. Thank you my lady. A twinkle of amusement turned her lips into a smirk. Oh, do not thank me yet, Lord Bracken, you still need to negotiate with the guilds and merchants. The path to your great road is merely beginning. Conceding the point, he remained silent as Patrack, Carl, and Catelyn left the room. Lucas never bothered to move so much as an inch. The words that came forth surprised him more than anything. You are right, Lord Bracken, we must change. When the armies of the north descended upon Riverrun I was elated at first. The Lions and the Westermen had burnt and sullied our homes to cover their own sins. They deserved and quite frankly still deserve what happened to them. But I was also there when we began clearing the grounds of the battlefield, of the true reality of a Thunderarm. How many times has a Blackwood or a Bracken attempted to end our families by themselves? More than memory can say. Exactly, now they could actually do it. But not before most were killed in revenge. No one will win our struggle, now or in the future. I will write to my father to ensure his cooperation. House Blackwood stands with you in this matter. Looking at the map of the proposed Trident Railway, he finally felt the melancholy that had held his heart for months alleviate. The game had changed, perhaps for the better. ASoIaF, Iron, Silver, and Gold, Part 1. AC 300, King's Landing, Westeros. Thean. 2 months. 2 months of writing messages, delivering orders, overseeing repairs, and pretty much anything else you could imagine. I had gotten more help in managing things as more literate Northerners took positions in the new Commonwealth Provisional Government. Getting Southerners had been difficult, since screening for Littlefinger supporters was difficult. Having Varys around helped with that, his intelligence network was invaluable. Though I had every single of his contacts assigned a Northern operative to keep them honest. All of this was done in a shit-smelling city that was lying mostly in ruins. The only things that kept me from going insane was my beloved family. And time away from my beloved family. Like today. I'd gotten aboard the Carrick Alligator, which was on a patrol of the Blackwater Bay towards the Narrow Sea. The captain, Captain Argon Ironclad, was a friend of mine who had flunked out of the Mechanics Guild but had worked his way up to captain in the Royal Northern Navy. So he was fine with me taking a spin with his valiant crew. As long as you don't touch anything, Argon said. I scowled. Dude. I basically invented modern sailing. And you've done enough, he said, patting me on the shoulder. So relax, Thean. Please. You're afraid I'll blow something up, aren't you? I said, still scowling. Argon smiled and shook his head. Of course not. I just want you to deal with this, Gentlemen, Argon said, quickly heading off towards the aft. I looked over at a nearby man in spectacles, wearing a nervous smile as he held a pencil and a notebook. "M'lord." Eddard Shorthand said. "It's nice to see you again." "Hey Eddard," I said, far less enthusiastically. Oh sure, I was proud of the fact that the first free press in the history of Westeros had arisen from the north. Okay, more or less free press. I had done my best, come on. That said, I wasn't exactly keen on talking to reporters. So. Failed to escape this time, hey? He asked with a knowing smile. I sighed and shrugged. Pretty much, yet. So. What shall we talk about? Shorthand and I were leaning against the railing overlooking the Blackwater. The great expanse of the narrow sea beckoned, and I could almost imagine the coast of Essos as a line in the distance. The reporter groaned and held his stomach. Oh. Oh gods. It's okay, I said, patting the seasick reporter. He groaned and rubbed his cheeks. Look, seasickness sucks for everyone. Believe you me. Thanks, he stuttered. Sure. So. Where was I? I was tempted to mess with him. But let's be honest, that wasn't good for the future of free press. So I took a deep breath. You were asking about the future of the Commonwealth? I asked. Shorthand nodded. Why yet? I mean, given this is the second time the North's had to come down south to sort out this nonsense. A lot of readers of the Despoiler have written letters, asking why we don't just stay uninvolved. We left a hell of a mess, and if we want to avoid having to come down here again for a third time, we need to clean it up, I said. At least, that's the assessment of King Robb, myself, and many other advisors. Then you intend to commit the forces of the North to resolving the issues of the rest of Westeros? Such an extended campaign would be costly. I nodded. I don't disagree, Eddard. Hence why the Commonwealth is a group effort. Other kingdoms pay us to train them up and get them back on their feet, so they can manage their internal security without us. And more than that, so we all have economic and military ties to bind us together. I nodded. The Seven Kingdoms had that, though, Shorthand pointed out. Yes, enforced by Valyrian rules and concepts that are seriously outdated, I said with a nod. In the Commonwealth, everyone has more of a stake in their kingdom. Not just nobles. Small folk too. This way, we're more like citizens, than subjects. Eddard smirked a bit. Very eloquent and idealistic, Lord Greyjoy. As usual. But no more than I've gleaned from other sources. I shrugged. Truth is, I prefer inventing to all this politicking. Seriously, that is just exhausting. I sighed and rubbed my forehead. And we've got bigger headaches to come, I grumbled. The rebuilding of the kingdom, the actual establishment of the Commonwealth, and the forthcoming summit with the Iron Bank of Bravos and other foreign representatives. Shorthand guessed, furiously scribbling notes. I looked over at him with an impressed expression. Varys must be feeling envious right now, I said. Mind revealing your sources to me? No good reporter ever does that, my lord, Eddard grinned. You know that. Besides, I'd have to incriminate you too, wouldn't I? I don't know what you're talking about, I said, the picture of innocence as I looked back at the water. Shorthand nodded, and looked with me. Of course, my lord. Of course. We both looked out at the sea, and took deep breaths. I groaned. Damn it, I can still taste it. I complained. I worked on a pig farm most of my life and I agree, Shorthand said with a nod. He took down notes. Would you say it's more like shit mixed with despair and burning, or shit mixed with burning garbage and rotting meat? And I think the interview is over, if you're asking softball questions like that, I said. Softball? Eddard asked. I sighed. Never mind. Skein, Iron, Silver and Gold, Part 2. AC 300, King's Landing, West Eros. Catalan. The travel time between the north and the south seemed to shrink ever further every time she took the journey. The last time, it had been via the Seawolf, a mighty vessel to be sure, and fast, making the journey in a matter of 3 weeks. Back on the train and carriage, only 2 weeks. Now, she looked out at King's Landing's docks, only a little over a fortnight out from White Harbour. The large sails of the HNMS Wolfswood pulled the great ship along, but she could still feel the vibration of the new steam engines working hard via the railing she held onto. She had thought she had caught sight of the Erie, far in the distance, as they passed the Fingers days ago. Half imagined, she could almost see the mountain peaks of the Vale. Almost her sister's face, and the face of her nephew. Almost see the glint of madness and grief in those eyes. She had shuddered, not wishing to think further on it. Catelyn pulled back into herself, closing her eyes. She took deep breaths, letting the sea air fill her lungs and letting her mind drift to happier thoughts. Good mother. She opened her eyes and looked over at Marjorie. She smiled warmly at her. The young woman had been difficult to read at the start, but after several months she had grown fond of her son's wife. Her tall bodyguard, Captain Lady Brienne, still haunted her steps even now. Hello Marjorie, Catelyn greeted, extending her arms for another hug. Marjorie returned it, slightly stiff. She supposed she may have been very affectionate as of late, but learning she carried her first grandchild made Catelyn feel so very, very old. Yet so very happy at the same time. You have been taking much time for yourself, as of late, Marjorie observed, her green eyes glinting softly in the still warm sun. She was wearing one of the latest northern fashions from Kiera Mills' catalogue, a blue and red dress, underneath a matching jacket with silver buttons. It made her look every inch the regal queen, and Catelyn approved. I thought I would check up on you, the queen said. Thank you, Marjorie, she said gratefully. She sighed as she looked back upon the sea, Marjorie's presence a comforting one at her side. The shouts of men and women crew, the calls of gulls, and the wind were the only sounds for a time. It feels like another lifetime since I saw these shores in peace, Catelyn confided. Marjorie nodded. I admit to some trepidation of my own, good mother, Marjorie replied. I had begun to call Winterfell home. Yes, Catelyn agreed. The greenhouses in the caverns surely helped with that, as they did for me. Marjorie laughed, a bit self-consciously. I'm afraid I'm not as rugged as you northerners, she apologized. Despite what the press claimed about me. Please, Catelyn said gently, please. Speak forthrightly. I have had enough of political games for now. Marjorie took a deep breath and sighed, letting out a hint of irritation. This, Catelyn believed, was far more trustworthy. Yes, well. I have missed Robb and my family terribly, she admitted. Getting to know all of the North was overwhelming. Almost exhausting. Catelyn granted her a sincerely kind look, and squeezed her hand. Believe me, I know, she admitted. Every day, it seemed, Theon would come up with something new, and one of those he taught came up with something else new, and then there would be explosions and fire and people laughing. She sighed, and rubbed her temple. He was enough for 4 mothers to deal with. Combined with everyone else. Marjorie laughed, a bit deeper than her usual graceful tinkling giggle. I suppose that is the normal state then. For you. Constant change. It hasn't been all bad, Catalan admitted with a smile. I had no joy at first dealing with the ladies of the textiles plant, but given we all shared a single love, it was pleasant enough. They seemed to get along without me just fine, despite their protestations. And that theatre tribute to you was very moving, Marjorie said. Catalan groaned. Embarrassing, more like it. Especially dealing with Grenon Blessed. Finest actor in the north, indeed. He has the ego for 10 mediocre ones. He was good enough as Hamnet, Marjorie commented, smiling almost sadly. I myself felt my heart almost break during that soliloquy. Catalan nodded. I suppose he's earned his status, she observed softly, thinking back to how she had treated Amerda. I hope I have earned as much with you, good mother, Marjorie said, a bit more carefully. Catalan smiled, and squeezed her hand. More than enough, she confided. She sighed and looked back at the approaching King's Landing. I hope I live long enough to see what we will do for this city. What we will make it into. All the wretchedness, the betrayal, the spite, the greed. If we could remove even a bit of it, to make it something worthwhile, I would be content. It will take more than these wonders to do that, good mother, Marjorie cautioned. Far more. I know, Catalan said quietly. I allow myself so little hope now. I have to hold on to something. We will find Bran, I know we will, Marjorie counseled her, stroking her shoulder. We found Arya, didn't we? Yes, Catalan nodded, yes we did. She still had to remind herself of that fact, which is why she kept the letter from her in her coat pocket at all times. Begging your pardon, your grace, Lady Catalan, Major Tarth, a sailor said, his hat in his hands and his head bowed politely, there's a raven from his majesty awaiting you. She saw Marjorie's concerned expression. Catalan shook her head, smiling comfortingly. I will gladly take it, Marjorie said with a smile. She looked over at Catalan. Will you be all right, good mother? Just fine, Marjorie, she said. Go. We'll see Rob soon enough. The Queen curtsied, and walked off, Brienne ever following her in silence. Catalan looked back at the water, taking deep breaths. Another sailor ventured up alongside, at a respectful distance. My lady? He asked. Catalan looked over at him. He was young, younger than Rob but only by a little. Freckles across round cheeks, and a broad chin. Are you all right? Can I get you anything? No, she said softly, her eyes returning to the horizon. She saw a familiar banner on a galley, far off. She narrowed her eyes. She heard the sailor's steps as he departed, and raised her hand. Wait. Can you get me farceurs? Yes my lady, the sailor said. He produced a pair from his belt, and she took them. She held the heavy things up and focused on the ship, which was bigger in her vision but blurry. Sorry my lady, let me adjust those. He reached over and turned knobs, the image slowly coming into focus. Her eyes narrowed, and a flash of anger struck through her breast like a bolt of lightning. That's the Sea Falcon, the sailor identified. A Vale ship, yes. Yes. The Lord of the Vale ship, Catalan said tightly. Lord Baelish, right? The sailor asked. You would know better than me, my lady, given. Ah. She turned a baleful glare on him, and he stuttered. Ah, I am sorry, I didn't. Catalan closed her eyes tightly, and tried to calm herself. You did nothing, she said. She opened them, taking a deep breath. My apologies, seaman. Ah. Poxton drum, my lady, he said politely. Catalan hummed. From Barrowden? The Barrowden drums. Yes my lady, he said with a smile at the recognition from the royal mother. Got accepted to the navy. Me folks were so proud. Good, Catalan said. Well, seaman drum. I have another task for you. Go to my stateroom. Bring me my revolver, in my valise. Bring it to me, here. Tell no one. Ah. Yes my lady. Poxton said, trying to hide his confusion but failing. It will be done, my lady. He turned and headed off, leaving Catalan to look back at the ship. The rage returned, but she kept her calm. Peter. She thought, this will be the last time we meet. I will remember it long after. Long after, indeed. Lord of the Vale or not, she would kill Peter. She would have her revenge. Silly Omake, inquisitive northerners in Quarth. At a reception party held in front of the mansion of one of the 13, the sorcerer from the House of Black and White just appeared in 2 places at once to awe/taunt/lure the northern delegation to his temple and steal their tech samples. A big, bearded mechman of the northern ambassadorial delegation leans in close to the sorcerer. Ooh, how are you doing that? He asks with open glee. Sorcerer Iteration 1 frowns uncomfortably, taking a step back. A gear wife, circling around Sorcerer Iteration 2, is it a time thing? Are you going to jump into the past in a few minutes? She hypothesizes out loud. Iteration 2 glowers menacingly, with a bit of a leer to him. Our ways are not so easily understood. He drawls. The mechman, grinning, splotches Sorcerer 1's robe with motor oil from the decanter on his belt. The Northern ambassador, amused with the antics of his underlings taking his political adversary down a notch, glances from one sorcerer to the other. Stain didn't transfer, so he's not time traveling, at least not in that direction. He concludes with a hint of disappointment, while Sorcerer 1 fumes in irritation at the stain on his robe. Any other theories? The gear wife hums, considering. It's not an illusion. She prods a bemused Iteration 2 with her finger. Did he actually split himself? The gruff mechman grumbles, patting his viper. If they were enemies, I'd shoot one of them, see if killing one would kill the other, but that would be rather ill-advised. The Northern ambassador concurs disapprovingly. Meanwhile, the entire Quarthian crowd is horrified and quietly backing away, literally backing into houses and falling over railings as they try and get out of the sorcerer's sacrifice radius. SSC attitude is to fear magic. The North isn't intimidated so easily. XCIV, Iron, Silver, and Gold, Part 3. AC 300, King's Landing, Westeros. Thien. I held the binoculars to my eyes and studied the galley as it rode slowly towards the dock. It was a massive example of its sort, almost 300 oars, a heavy iron ram, its bow decorated with gold, the sail woven with the emblem of the Vale. The Sea Falcon was one of the most powerful warships in Westeros, or at least, it had been. Today, the galley was escorted by 2 frigates of the Royal Navy, the Brandon and the Ricard. Tall, 3-masted vessels, their lines were sharp, raised low to the water with only a vestigial aft castle, their sides were studded with cannon ports. There was no need for elaborate decorations, apart from their carved figureheads. Like all royal warships, their hulls were painted dark grey with a white stripe along the gun ports. Without rams or oars, they would have been considered prey a decade ago, mere targets for the heavier, longer galley, but that was then. Now, the galley was completely outclassed. If that wasn't a metaphor for the changing times, I don't know what is. A mounted knight in full armor with pennant flying might be a splendid sight, but against a common trooper in wolf grey carrying a rifle. I shook my head. Lowering the glasses, I passed them to Rob. We're gonna have to work out what we're gonna do with him, I stated, even as the king raised the glasses to study the warship himself. We stood on the battlements above the mud gate. Below us flowed a constant stream of fishmongers, traders, and northern personnel. All, in one way or another, victims of Peter Baelish's machinations. I want to kill him, said Rob, his voice calm without a hint of rancor. Some part of me shivered, remembering a kind, friendly boy who had welcomed me to Winterfell as a child, but I kept my face straight. This wasn't my brother Rob speaking, it was the king in the north and the trident. After everything he's done, after everything Mother, you, and even Tyrion said, he deserves to die. I took a slow, calming breath. I don't disagree, I stated, resting my hands on the red stone of the battlements. Still, he's your cousin's guardian, was married to your aunt, and is coming to bend the knee in the name of the Vale. With them joining us, it's just a matter of organizing the Stormlands and dealing with the islands, and then we're done, Rob. There won't be anyone left to fight south of the wall, and we can focus on what really matters, getting Sansa back, and getting ready for the real war. I know, sighed Rob, lowering the glasses. And if I kill him, or even arrest him, what message will that send to Lord Royce, to the other lords of the Vale, to cousin Robert? He shook his shaggy head, and beside him Grey Wind growled, low and vicious. But I really want to kill him. I reached out and squeezed his shoulder. I know. I took a deep breath. We'll deal with him later. For now? Other problems, all right. Rob managed a nod, and looked over at me with the same intensity Grey Wind could muster. Preparations? He asked. I looked over the missives I held in my hand. Proceeding, but slowly. Wartime production levels are still going, since the contracts are still in place. The excess will be diverted to the wall for testing purposes. The first levies are returning home. I gave him a small smile. I thought having the venture bringing home the first couple of troops to White Harbor would be a nice touch. Make for a nice photo OP. Rob nodded, Grey Wind smirking for him. Good. John. I sighed and flipped through the pages. I needed to invent better page dividers. He's got several thousand free folk ready to settle on the gift. Which is going to be fun times, let me tell you. I shook my head. I don't envy the guy who has to sort all that out. The Northerners were a fiercely independent people, but they hated wildlings. And the wildlings weren't too fond of us back. That much animosity in the old timeline was more manageable due to the fact our side didn't have guns then. Now, it seemed like a disaster in the making. Even the prospect of icy apocalypse couldn't dampen the enthusiasm these people took to tearing each other apart. Though I suppose that was just human nature. I know, Rob said with a sigh. If I could, I'd put you in charge of it. But with Sansa and Daenerys? I need dragons, Theon. We need dragons. Yeah, I know, I grumbled. I've got the Karstarks on it, Rob said. I raised my eyebrows, and he shook his head. Torrhen's proven a fine leader and with the appropriate babysitters? I asked. Granted, the Karstarks were loyal and able allies, but diplomats? Not exactly. Advisors, Rob corrected, I'm sure he'll do fine. With the right people to guide him. I nodded. Probably, I admitted. I looked back over my notes. The Martells are all set up and are holding a press conference in the next few hours concerning the Commonwealth. Scuttlebutt says they're in favor of it, so this should just be a routine announcement. Your honored good father is already preparing a feast. And the Wolfswood will be docking soon with Mother and Marjorie. And Amerda, I thought, but I didn't have to say that. Rob could tell my thoughts went to her immediately. I set down the papers on the red stone, grimacing a bit. The stink was still bad. I didn't know how Rob and Grey Wind withstood it. Their senses had to be much better than mine. Rob nodded. It's a start. A slow start, but at least we're moving. He looked at me with a concerned expression. What's wrong? I supposed I wasn't able to hide anything from him anymore. I turned my pensive gaze to my brother and king, and shrugged a bit sheepishly. I sometimes wish I could be in multiple places at once. Guilt, fear, anguish, all of that had been driving me since day one in Westeros. Now, with the real war on the horizon, I was finding so much left to handle. So much more to do. So many larger headaches, and I was soon to leave this place. Leave my home, to go to a foreign land on a desperate mission. It was a bit harrowing, if I'm honest. Theon, if anyone deserves gratitude for all he's done, it's you. So stop being unhappy with never getting enough done. You have, Rob said, reaching out to grip my shoulder. I smiled back, and got at least a bit of warmth back. He was still my brother, despite the burdens laying ever thicker on him like snow in winter. He then smirked at me, a wolfish humor in his gaze. Besides, you'd drive yourself insane in 5 minutes. Tops. Please. 10 minutes, I huffed. Give me a little credit. Do you always have to have the last word? Rob asked. Ask the king, I said dryly. I'm not wrong, Rob said. I guess not, I admitted. A/N, so, yet another ship-based Omake, one that will be far more martial than the one before. The original plan was to have the North catch the Ironborn by surprise while they were mid-raid, but Andrew pointed out this would be better. So, enjoy. Bear vs Squid, round. Fight. Once more, unto the breach. At least, that was how she felt. Then again, it was her fault. Sort of. She had boasted well enough of her men's capabilities, fully demonstrated in the brief time between the Old Bear's construction and the end of the war against the Lannisters. How they had sunk a goodly part of their fleet, and then left the Lannisport docks a ruin which was now being rebuilt after her own visit to Lannisport. Then, news came from Casterly Rock, apparently, Theon Greyjoy's entreaties with his sister had failed to produce the expected result, and the fuckers had decided to keep up with their old ways attitude. Only, this time they were going against a weaker enemy, the Westerlands, which she had so efficiently left bereft of any means to defend itself from attacks by the sea. So, now they requested, following the terms of the alliance signed between King Robb and Lord Tyrion Lannister, the support required to repel their attacks, and hopefully put an end to their madness. Ah, the staggering irony of what she had to do now. Save their former enemies from their ancient enemies. And that was how she now found herself Admiral of the Sunset Sea Fleet of the North, combining Bear Harbors and Deepwood Mott's ships under one structure. Sure, it was not so long ago that the Mormont's HNMS Seawolf, flagship of the Narrow Sea Fleet, had made its way along the western coast to escort then Lady Marjorie Tyrell, now Queen Marjorie, from the Reach to Sigurd. Here, in the west, it was her ships that ruled the roost. In this case, her ship, the HNMS Old Bear. And the associated fleet, of course, formed by ships of every class, from Season and Winterfell-class brigs to the Dagger-class sloops that had played merry hell on the Lannisters' trading fleet during the war. Her farsa over her eyes, she inspected the makeup of the 30-strong fleet and nodded. Lord Stormbear, she asked her second-in-command, her sempitern shadow since she took over as captain of the Old Bear. What do you make of the fleet disposition? They seem to be in good order, my lady. Though, the Araka's captain has overtaken Arrow, Cannonball, Razor, and Bolt. If she is not careful, she might hinder the sloop's maneuvers. She has? She asked, and directed her gaze toward the aforementioned ships, on the port side of her ship. Yes, there it was. She had missed it at first glance, but now that Lord Stormbear had pointed it out, she could see it clear as the day. I suppose we ought to warn Lady Flint not to be so eager to fight the Ironborn, there will be more than enough for everyone. Send a raven to her. I would rather not to see our plan of battle sunk because someone was eager for some fried squid. I shall see to it, Lady Captain, Lord Stormbear replied, walking off to see the maester in charge of the old bear's ravens. Of course, their use during battle was fairly limited. That was what battle flags were for, but in this kind of circumstances, a raven might be better, as it would send the message without calling undue attention. She wished she could have a radio, but their number was so far limited, and they would probably require space that few ships, even those of new construction, did not have. She directed her gaze ahead, to prow, and gazed upon the horizon. They did not know where the Ironborn ships would be, exactly. This was the best approximation she had been given. But it should be enough to catch the Ironborn and put an end to their predations. This time the Greenlanders will die. We will pay the iron price. The Kraken's kisses, Captain shouted, and the crew cheered his words as they prepared for their assault on Lannisport. Not for burning their ships, but to reeve like good Ironborn. To take plunder, thralls, salt wives, and ships to pike, and be greeted like the Ironborn they were. Save for his first mate. I noted doubt in your words, Captain. What's the problem? He asked when they were alone. The captain growled. It's that, damn traitor, the boomsquid. We all thought that we would be reclaiming our independence, what with the Greenlanders being in the middle of their war. We thought the North would be an easy prey. But instead of doing as someone with iron and salt in his veins, the boomsquid became a Greenlander and helped them against us. He gave them thunderers and cannons, gave them new ships, gave them the means to stop us from taking what is ours. Then he went and captured our king, his own father, and his sister. And then he had his father killed. I know the Greyjoy girl said he killed himself, but there is no way our king would kill himself. And thank the drowned god we chose the Crow's Eye for a king. We would have had to stop reaving if she took over, no matter what King Balon intended. Maybe. The first mate said, before cutting off as he was glared at by the captain. You've seen what she did when she lost. She went and left for the mainland again, probably to warn them, the traitorous bitch. But I doubt she'll be able to warn them of our king's plans. Euron had won most of the king's moot to his side when he claimed that he would make the Dragon Queen at the east marry him, and Westeros would fall to him when he controlled her dragons with the horn he said he had found in the ruins of Valyria. Nothing would be able to stand up to 3 dragons, not even the traitorous son of their former king and his coward's weapons. I don't much trust the Crow's Eye's word, Captain. And I think you don't, either. The captain glowered and turned to the prow. Matters not. He's king now. And he orders that we reeve. So we do. And we should be glad for this fog. The Greenlanders won't see us coming. Aye, the first mate replied, while the men prepared their weapons, hooks and ropes for the assault of Lannisport. The fog was not important, for many of them had gone through this place several times already, some of them had even been there during the previous, glorious attack that had left the city burning. There was no way this could end differently. But then, something strange happened, a bell started to sound out. What the fuck? One of the veterans muttered, as the group stopped moving. Is there a problem, you landlubbers? The captain screamed. It's just, that bell was closer than Lannisport's should be, and that one's a big un, would have sounded a lot different. Who gives a damn? Just then, amid the fog, a silhouette started to show. A form that should not exist, should not be here. But, nonetheless, it was there. One that a few of them had survived by pure luck, and which none of them felt glad to see. Fuck, the first mate muttered, and the captain felt inclined to agree with him. A fucking northern ship. Chain shot for our cannons, Lord Stormbear, Lyanna Mormont said, observing the soon-to-be battlefield. Destroy their masts. Those of our ships that can be boarded by the Greyjoys, remain away from them. Have the riflemen prepare for ship-to-ship combat. Any of them that surrenders or that has lost enough people, board with care and arrest the surviving sailors. If the ship is still seaworthy, bring food and water to the rowers and tell them they will be freed when they reach the closest port. Otherwise, get everyone to one of our ships and sink the Ironborns. Lord Tyrion and Sir Kevan Lannister will probably be interested in buying the ships we capture. Aye, Captain, her companion said. The flags would be useless in this fog, but that did not matter, powerful lights could be used for the same task, lights that penetrated through the morning mist that always appeared over the sea in front of Lannisport. As the sun rose, it would dissipate, thus allowing them to communicate better. Not that we are likely to need it, she thought, while she calmly remained at the prow of the old bear, dispassionately gazing through her farsa at the forms she knew were the Ironborn, her family's greatest enemies for centuries. It seemed that everything they had taught them in these years had yet to establish itself in their minds. Today, they would receive a far worse lesson. The deck of the Kraken's Kiss was chaos, as men struggled to consider what to do now. They were brave men, all down to their wet toes, but the mere sight of the Leviathan in front of them was enough to make the most ferocious Ironborn wet their pants and call to their mothers. "Shut your traps, you cunts! And prepare for battle!" The captain shouted, pushing his crew around to put them in position, to ready their weapons. Not that any of them believed they had a chance at using them. Already, the northern ship's cannons were thundering, sending their deadly projectiles against them. All of a sudden, 3 Ironborn ships lost their main mast, and 7 more had their sails destroyed by what, to a sharp-eyed sailor, appeared to be 2 small iron balls tied together with a chain. Another thunder, and soon after the Kraken's Kiss violently shook as they were hit. 5 of its men were hit by the chain and balls and died almost instantly when the balls shattered their bodies or the chain literally broke them in twain. Their bodies had, however, cushioned the attack so, when it hit the mast, it only caused great damage to it, instead of utterly shattering it and leaving the ship without its main mean of propulsion. Not that knowing that did any wonders for their dropping morale. As is, the fact that their fellow Ironborn were being destroyed left and right, and that none of the northern ships were close enough for even the best Ironborn archers, of which there are few, of course, to reach with their bows, was soul-crushing to say the least. Another cannon thundered, and at least half the crew winced when they saw the Hard Hand losing its mast, along with several crewmen, who screamed bloody murder when they were crushed by the large wooden post. But the worst was yet to come. That's... One of them stuttered, pointing at the large ship that had been the one closest to them, and now it was close enough that they could see what it was. "An iron ship?" the captain asked, stunned. They had heard of them, of course, but they had thought it was just rumors made up by the Greenlanders. A ship of iron should only belong to men of iron. Only, now there was proof, right in front of them, that Greenlanders did indeed have such ships. The shock was too much for several of them, who dropped to the ground in fetal positions and trembled, their minds snapped by the situation. Not that he could not blame them, for he himself suddenly longed for the easier time in which his mother took care of him when he was but 5 name days old. And then, one of the few men that was still standing dropped to the deck, his mouth screaming itself hoarse and his shoulders sprouting blood as smaller thunders began coming from the iron ship's own deck. "Thunderers, they have people using thunderers from atop that ship." "Drat, I missed," Julia McKay grumbled. "I hit the man next to that ship's captain. And he's going to bleed out if someone does not stop it." "It is the first time you shoot from ship to ship in these circumstances, Miss McKay," Lina Mormont told her. "You only missed at 3 feet from a distance of 300 feet. Much better than most." "Still not perfect," Julia said, loading another bullet into her special issue whistler. "No need to shoot again, they are striking their banners," Lord Stormbear said. "It appears that they are quite stunned, and a few of them are lying on the deck while they suck their thumb." Much laughter was had on the Old Bear's main deck at the image, and Lina Mormont allowed herself a smile before turning back to her men, who immediately sobered. "The battle is not ended yet. Signal the Deepwood Mott to get to that ship and take their survivors. We shall continue our hunt." Sailors saluted and scrambled to follow her orders, while she continued to observe the battle. Or, rather, the curb stomp battle. She would have to ask Lord Greyjoy what a curb was, and why stomping on it was supposed to be so important. XCV, Iron, Silver, and Gold, Part 4. AC 300, King's Landing, Westeros. Peter. The clopping of hooves and the cheering of the crowds echoing in his ears, Peter Baelish smiled as the familiar aroma of King's Landing filled his senses. After so long in the high, clear mountain air of the Vale, the humid, pungent sense of perfume and feces that so defined the capital was an assault on his nose, but he endured, as it was also the smell of power. King's Landing was the center of the realm, for centuries the pivot point about which the continent of Westeros had revolved. Here were many of his most profitable businesses, here were his most influential contacts, here were the greatest opportunities. Robb Stark may blather about forming a new commonwealth, of changing the way Westeros is ruled, but in the long run, the players may change but the game remains. This is a game to which I know the rules, a dance to which I know all the steps. This so-called king is but a northern barbarian like his father, like his uncle. Easy to manipulate, easy to rile, easy to guide. To his side rode Lord Royce, resplendent in his archaic, rune-carved armor. Behind them followed 24 knights of the Vale, 24 more squires, and almost 100 spearmen on foot, a fitting entourage for the Lord Protector of the Kingdom of Mountain and Vale. Baelish had considered having a set of plate fascian for himself, but had almost instantly rejected the idea. He was not a warrior, and would only appear foolish were he to emulate the manner of a knight. Instead, he wore his finest robes, tasteful and expensive jewelry, his hair and goatee trimmed to perfection. His mount was from one of the finest of the Vale's prized bloodlines, exquisitely trained and exceedingly calm, a great benefit, as he was hardly the most gifted horseman. He was, in every way, the very ideal of a powerful lord come to meet with his peer, a regent for a king meeting with that king's cousin. And before long, while I discuss the details of bringing the Vale into this commonwealth with Stark's advisors, the boy will hardly be interested in the minutiae of treaty making. I will of course work closely with Cat, my cat. In time, I will bring her around, remind her of what we shared as children, and she will forget the sullen, dim-witted brute she was forced to marry. Peter smirked inwardly, everything falling into place in his mind. Once Maya is declared the legitimate heir to King Robert, and I am named her guardian as I am young King Robert, oh, the irony is delicious. I will encourage Cat to convince Rob to name Maya as Lady Paramount of the Stormland, and I will become ruler in all but name to 2 kingdoms, more, once Cat agrees to marry me. And once Rob realizes that he is as ill-suited to rule the 7 kingdoms as Robert Baratheon was, he will realize he needs a hand to rule in his stead, and who better than his new good father. True, Greyjoy is an annoyance, but easily dealt with. After all, he plays with explosive powder and wildfire every day, and accidents do happen. Accidents he could arrange. His mind was focused on the future, and so he barely noticed when the robed figure stepped out of the crowd in front of his horse. By the time he noticed the 7-pointed star carved into the bald man's forehead, he had already pulled the thunderarm from the sleeve of his robe and leveled it at Peter. Die, whoremonger! He cried shrilly, and he vanished in a cloud of smoke and fire as a 10-pound sledgehammer struck Peter in the center of the chest, knocking him backwards off his horse and sending him crashing against the cobblestones of the street. Peter stared blearily up at a face that looked entirely too stark for his liking. Was he dead? Was this hell? The pain registered a moment before he saw the rusty hair and realized this must be Cat's oldest son. Your Grace. He gasped. Not quite, how I had envisaged meeting you, for the first time. The Northman nodded solemnly and patted him firmly on the shoulder. You're lucky not to have died immediately, Lord Baelish. Few men can survive being shot twice in the chest. A strange sort of luck. Yes. The eyes were Ned Stark's. So very much like that Claude's. Mother told me how good you were at surviving. Peter paused. He'd been shot twice? The first he remembered, but the second. After he'd hit the cobbles perhaps? He heard a door open and tilted his head slightly. Ah, Ramsay. Rob seemed pleased at the arrival. Not taking you away from anything important, am I? Anything for a friend of Theon's, the other man said cheerfully. Now where's our victim? Yes, he felt very victimized, Peter agreed. Right here. The Stark leant over and poked at what Peter now realized were bandages across his chest. Arg, he cried out. So we want the second round to be near that, somewhere it can have caused some sort of internal wound the maesters overlooked. Peter's eyes snapped wide. What? Right. His mind settled on a plan of action. His cries for aid were cut off when the new arrival, Ramsay Bolton? Oh no. Crammed a pungent handkerchief in his mouth. The man patted his cheek fondly. Now that was a nasty oversight, Your Grace. Can't be having him cry for help. You're right. The Stark looked apologetic. It's my first time, he admitted. It's good you knew to ask for an expert's help then. Ramsay held up a short stick. Now here we have a crossbow bolt, except I've replaced the point with a musket ball. What I'll do is line it up and then you hammer the end until we drive it deep enough for a mortal wound. Robb Stark nodded and lifted up a small mallet. How long do you think it'll take? Quarter hour or so. Depends how much he clings to life. It's an art, not a science, Robb. I think we can count on Lord Baelish to hold onto life very tightly indeed. The door creaked again and the 2 young men spun around, hiding the implements of this torturous scheme behind their backs. Mother. And there was Cat's voice. Ah, he was saved. Robb? Ramsay? What are you doing here? Just, examining his lingering wounds. Seeing if they're mortal. The boy that Stark had been reduced to explained hastily. Robb, are you here to murder this man? There was a long pause. I'm very annoyed with you, Robb. Aha. You should have invited me. Peter saw Catelyn's eyes narrow dangerously. He'd never seen this before. It's a wife's duty to avenge her husband. That was very selfish of you. I'm sorry, Mother. Peter turned his head away, so he didn't have to see them embrace rather than to hide the tears of fear and hatred on his face. Now explain to me how you're doing this, Ramsay. Now here we have a crossbow bolt, except... Oh make. Money talks. Ruse. The Iron Bank's delegation had arrived early this morning. 3 key holders, the minimum needed renegotiate the 3 million gold dragons of debt that the 7 kingdoms owed Bravu's central institution. The debt the crown had accrued over King Robert's reign was staggering. The Spider had confirmed the Boomskid's suspicion that a lot of that debt had come from Peter Baelish's financial trickery. Finance wasn't really Ruse's strongest point, but happenstance and Theon Greyjoy had often led him to new experiences these last few years. When the cog carrying the 3 Brave ambassadors and their retainers cut through the fog this morning, Roose had been discussing the religious unrest in the city with Lord Greyjoy. But when the young genius's eyes fell on the Brave ship which bore an iron-banded hull and a row of cannon ports, and even to Roose's untrained eye looked sleeker with reduced castling and triangular sails, he was politely but firmly asked by an uncharacteristically sanguine Greyjoy to oversee negotiations with the Iron Bank of Bravus, and find out where they'd obtained this almost northern-looking ship. It had doubtlessly been a purposeful taunt by the Bank of Bravus to arrive so early in the morning in a ship that had clearly taken inspiration from northern shipbuilding ideas, then having the ambassadors slip away into the city before anyone of sufficient rank could come in and greet/stop them. Now he was walking through the streets around the base of the former Red Keep, toward the Bravus embassy, a stately stone house looming at the end of the street, pressed against the city walls. It said a lot about the Iron Bank that they were so intertwined with the government of Bravus that the embassy was unhesitatingly appropriated for the coming negotiations. It was a concession to the bank to meet them in their own den. Or at least it would appear that way to the 3 key holders. He was flanked by the 2 most silver-tongued men among the high nobles of Westeros, Lord Tyrion Lannister and Prince Oberyn Martell. They cut quite a figure, with only a handful of northern troops around them, walking through the late afternoon bustle of the richest part of town. Even the halfman had quite a lot of experience walking along with his longer-legged peers, it would seem, his brisk stride keeping pace with himself and Prince Martell, who came up with the perfectly Dornish idea of leaping into the lion's den and calling it a surprise attack. The 3 men did a last review of what they knew of the 3 key holders that had come to the city as they walked. They passed thin folders of A4 paper back and forth, sparse notes on what northern intelligence knew about each key holder, hurriedly amended with post-it notes written by the Spider. First there was Alaron Domram, foreman of the Arsenal of Bravus, born in Newquays. While his position kept the man in constant contact with both the Sea Lord and the other key holders of the bank, he didn't truly have their ear. The man was a war hawk, constantly pushing to finance privateers against their southern slaver neighbors and expeditions to capture this or that island of the Stepstones. His pushy nature led to him not being taken very seriously in the city of canals. Second, Silna Arnovis, the first ever female keyholder of Bravus. Her late husband was a keyholder, but apparently left most of the actual work to his highly intelligent wife, who used the success of northern women as a reason why she should be allowed to keep her husband's wrought iron key. Note by Varys, she almost definitely murdered her husband 2 years ago. The woman was also known to be cruel and capricious, floating a law to put known slavers to work in the house of Bravus nobles as slaves themselves and having almost a dozen young men and women disappear into her basement over the last decade, never to return. In earlier life, Roose Bolton might have underestimated Lady Arnovis, but having met Olenna Tyrell, as well as quite a few other skilled women, he was now wary of both her apparent political power and her sadistic nature, something other men might have japed about being a woman's right but a few years ago. The last of the 3 key holders was Aram Valerno. Not much was known about the man. The only remarkable things about him were that he owned the largest private library in Bravus, which he had opened to the public. The man was also almost always found reading, and apparently had a memory pressed in Valyrian steel, for the man was never known to make notes, always soaking up the details of the meetings attended while reading some book or other. The 3 Westerosi nobles walked through the ironwood doors of the Bravus embassy and looked around at the wood and greenstone decorations that immediately pressed in all around them. Lord Lannister and Prince Martell gave each other sidelong glances as they for a moment felt strangers in their own city. Indeed, the windowless corridors seemed to be decorated in the same gloomy yet glossy stone of the Iron Bank itself. At the end of the corridor, sitting on the far end of a short hall, were the 3 key holders. Across them, 3 simple oak chairs. Roose spared a meaningful dry glare at 3 of the 6 soldiers that were currently protecting them. While the other 3 walked toward the walls to wait for their lords to be finished, the 3 soldiers who Roose had flashed his not amused face picked up the wooden chairs and carried them away to the sides of the room, before joining their squad mates at parade rest. Oberyn, Roose, and Tyrion walked up to the wide table at which the 3 key holders were sitting in their elevated thrones, and simply stood there. Oberyn was smirking, Roose was rather indifferent, and Lord Lannister opened his mouth. "Thank you for coming to our capital to renegotiate the extremely large loans that the 7 kingdoms have made with you." Roose was not as good with words as Tyrion. Hardly anyone was. But he could see Lannister was baiting the hook, admitting the legitimacy of the loan. And indeed, 2 of the key holders leaned forward just an inch. Valerno was bent over an enormous ledger and did not seem to be entirely in attendance. While the 7 kingdoms no longer exist, and the late master of coin spending of the money is currently under investigation, Tyrion continued, the Commonwealth of Westeros and all its components have chosen to take responsibility for the unresolved debts. The crone, Arnovis, smiled. It reminded him of Ramsay's smile. And while his son had learned to chain his inner beast, like Roose had done, like this woman had hopefully done, seeing a fellow predator flaunt her mania worried Roose just a little. Good to see the Sunset Kingdoms have not gone crazy being freed from the Iron Throne. On Roose's other side, Oberyn stepped forward. But chains of iron still bind us. The swarthy Dornishman produced a square iron coin from between his fingers, and rolled it over his fingers. Metaphorically speaking, of course. Though not so metaphorically for the Northmen who've been shipped to Slavers Bay. Oberyn smiled mischievously at Foreman Domram, then turned back to Arnovis, seated in the middle of the three key holders. Domram leaned forward. The other free cities, the man made air quotes with his fingers, another theonism that had apparently floated over the narrow sea, and the cities of Slavers Bay have never been great friends of Bravus. If you have plans to intercede in the bay, we might be willing to offer our assistance. At the same moment, Valerno licked his lips. But not if you're going after Daenerys Targaryen. She is the last true Valian ruler, and now she has dragons. She is literally a dragon lord. As a Bravasi to a Dornishman. One does not fuck with dragons lightly. The skinny man drawled matter-of-factly, deigning to briefly glare up from his ledger. Roose had to resist the urge to raise his eyebrows. So much for that part of the script, though Oberyn did push that point of the agenda earlier than the three men had agreed. Oberyn took a step back and looked to Roose, the calm center of the power trio, as Theon had said of himself, Dan Greenstone and Amr Dahan once. With the stormy Martell on one side and the flowing words of the charming lion on the other, Roose was a good choice for the figure in the middle. Quiet but intimidating. We are prepared to repay the entire debt in full. Roose decided to play their ace in the hole after Arnovis and Valerno had so completely rebuked Oberyn's seductions. 100,000 a year, for 30 years. Lady Arnovis's eyes widened in surprise, while Foreman Domram's jaw flapped open. Valerno just frowned as he kept reading his giant book. That would be agreeable. Domram replied hoarsely, while Lady Arnovis nodded along meekly. However, to be able to pay our debts, we would require a 5-year grace period, a stay of execution if you will, to allow the North's economy to return to a peace footing, to rebuild and industrialize the southern kingdoms, etc. Tyrion made the universal gesture for and so on, and so forth. Keyholder Domram seemed almost happy. The doorman had gone into the negotiations worried, paranoid and disappointed from the get-go. He was pleasantly surprised that the Sunset Kingdoms not only wanted to repay their debts in full, in a reasonable time frame, without interest, but to fully recoup their investment was beyond expectations already, but they were also nudging for an alliance against the slaver cities. Or at least against slavery, but it'd be practically the same thing. Keyholder Arnovis wasn't buying it. Those are suspiciously generous terms. She tapped the side of her eyeglasses with her finger. I can understand that the explosion of ingenuity from the north could finance this plan easily enough, but why the 5-year gap if you could just say we're not the 7 kingdoms anymore, goodbye, today. 2. Maintain faith in the gold dragon as a currency. Tyrion tried meekly. Arnovis just scowled predatorily at the short Lannister. You're not telling me? She feigned a cough when Valerno actually looked up from his book to glare at her. Something. What is the real reason, or perhaps the main reason you want a 5-year grace period? She asked imperiously. Oberyn's turn. He chuckled bashfully. Well, we have a rather unexpected problem up north. I doubt you could guess what it is, but it's something that will require the Commonwealth's full attention for quite a while. He replied, sounding rather embarrassed to admit. Martell's embarrassment was fake, of course, just another part of the mummery, but Roose could imagine that the source of Oberyn's remarkably good acting came from a quite real astonishment that northern legends and nightmares had apparently become real. Are the North's common folk rebelling? Arnovis asked. The small folk are content, more so than ever, Roose knew. Is there a schism between your lesser noble houses? Perhaps Riverlanders, the Freys. They are also content. Like Roose himself, Valder Frey was an opportunist, currently drowning in dragons, flush with military power and, most absurdly, the affection of the small folk. Guess again, murderous. Are the wildmen north of your giant ice wall getting restless? Domram tried after Arnovis only got bemused stares and Lannister's subdued snickering. No, but you're closer than your peer. Tyrion half congratulated. A large group of wildlings are currently being given refuge south of the wall, while most of the others. Roose's turn. Are most likely dead by now, and raised as whites. This caused another round of surprised exclamations. Even Valerno's head snapped up. Repeat that last part. He asked reflexively. The dead walk in the frozen north. Oberyn responded, sincere annoyance and dread leaking into his voice. We have evidence on the way to King's Landing, and we also know who's causing this desecration. He spat the word. The White Walkers, the others, men made of ice with endless malice toward the mortal peoples of Westeros. Tyrion expounded with resigned annoyance. I can barely believe it myself, but Lord Theon and King Rob's brother is entirely certain. Something absurd is happening beyond the wall, something on the scale of the doom of Valyria. Imagine, if you will, an unending tide of undead Northmen. Mindless, but fast and uncaring of harm, only to be killed by decapitation or incineration. A new long night, Perhaps truly one without sunshine for months and years, who can know? Oberyn cut in. We need to be as ready as we can. While we'll keep this revelation a secret for the coming few weeks, perhaps months, to maximize productivity, and we strongly insist you do the same, a new long night is coming. Tyrion declared grimly. Which is why we won't be able to pay you back for a few years. He concluded hesitantly, the sudden snapback in topic visibly discombobulating Arnovis and Domram. Aram Valerno pulled his giant tome shut. What can Bravos do to help? He asked, causing a confused Domram and an irate Arnovis's heads to snap toward him for making such a unilateral declaration. Tyrion smiled. In the unlikely case that the three of us aren't mad and this wasn't a mummers show preformed for your pleasure, we could certainly use your help in defending the northern coast. Other than that, we'd have to see how the nightmares from beyond the wall decide to wage war on us despicable living people. In such an unlikely event. Arnovis drawled sarcastically. Precisely. Tyrion riposted. There's a problem with that stratagem. If we become preoccupied fighting children's stories in a new war for the dawn. Domram hypothesized. The three daughters won't be able to resist the urge to take advantage. Oberyn filled in, comprehension dawning. Roose decided to open his mouth and take a page out of Valerno's book, make an unilateral statement in support of sanity and cooperation. If these less practical men wanted to wave their tongues at each other for sport, they could do so when the world wasn't at stake. If such a scenario were to occur, and the mighty fleet of Bravos was out fighting for the living, then the North and perhaps the entire Commonwealth would rush to their allies' defense. Tyrion's eyes were like saucers. Of course, this is all hypothetical and would need to be notarized if and when the storybook apocalypse begins, of course. He added hastily. Yes, of course. Arnovis hedged, belatedly realizing she'd tacitly agreed with the plan. Well, it was for everyone's good, she supposed. And she could always back out later, try and prevent Valerno and Domram from trying to convince the Sea Lord and the other key holders. But maybe she shouldn't? She'd need to think on this. One last thing, before I suppose we all head home for the night. Tyrion said collegially, and Roose turned to face the key holders. Would you tell us where you got your enhancements for your arsenal? And just like that, Foreman Domram's mood collapsed like a veil souffle. No, we will not. Valerno leaned over to talk into the ear of his fellow key holder, but loud enough that the Westerosi would hear. They already know that we've copied their designs. A close-up look by Greyjoy or one of his apprentices would show that parts of the rigging and the cannon mounts are designed exactly as the blueprints showed. We both know your men haven't had the chance to test. This was interesting. Blueprints from? Roose pressed. Blueprints from Euron Greyjoy, in exchange for a refit and an endless supply of ammunition. Valerno replied resignedly while glaring at Arnovis. Tyrion opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, Lady Arnovis leaned forward. We will quietly retract the one-eyed crow's permission to enter Bravos to restock his ammunition, and in return you will not use this information to vilify our beautiful rainy city in the eyes of the North and the rest of your people. She gestured dismissively. Are we agreed? She hissed, returning to her very undiplomat-like near panic. We are somewhat aware of what the elder Mad Greyjoy has been up to with the weapons we've given him. Domram explained flatly, with an undercurrent of anger directed at both Euron and Arnovis. Ah! Roose looked from keyholder Arnovis to the other two. This was an old disagreement between the three of them. One the crone had apparently now lost. Very well. Roose quickly answered. We will take our leave. Valerno nodded tersely, then pulled a northern ballpoint pen from his robes and immediately began writing letters at a furious speed. As the three nobles walked out of the building, they could hear a shouting match in an incomprehensible Valyrian code dialect between Arnovis and Domram, while unbeknownst to them Valerno, once again bent over his papers, kept on writing, to the Sea Lord, to the other key holders, even to his contact with the faceless men, not to actually do anything. He was empathically asking the murder priests to not do anything yet, but to warn all of them that either the Commonwealth's leadership had collectively gone mad, or they were indeed about to be submerged in a new long night. What other reason would they have to offer to repay their debt in full, other than the knowledge that in 5 years, outstanding loans would be the least of anyone's problems? The three key holders don't quite grasp the names of things in the Sunset Kingdoms. Especially Domram. This is deliberate. Oberyn and Tyrion's recalcitrance was part of their plan, to reel in the key holders to the idea of a hush-hush pact against slaver and zombie. Also, hey, 3 new Bravasi that you can use if you need an outside perspective on something. The bag was dragged off Theon's head. He blinked as his eyes adjusted to the admittedly dim candle light. Nephew. Euron was pouring ale into 2 cups. He'd probably drunk quite a bit already since he spilled as much ale on the table as ended up in the cups. Uncle. The younger Greyjoy wasn't as enthusiastic as he accepted the cup. Glad you accepted my invitation. Euron jerked his head and the sailors who dragged Theon to him left the room. I didn't feel like I could refuse. Wouldn't have been wise. One cup was pushed across the table. Congratulations, by the way. Thanks, for your invention. You'll have to be more specific. Euron turned and spun, showing off his long coat. It's amazing. He lowered his voice. The salt wives love a man in a long coat. Yeah. I guess. Well, you got all the brains that missed your father and brother. Might need to work on the confidence though. His uncle raised his cup. To family. Theon raised his cup and drained it wordlessly. He felt more need for the booze than he did to return the toast. Having reached the bottom of the cup he coughed. There's a boy. The older man gave him an approving look. You drink like a kraken. I'm sure once you get some practice you'll fuck like one. Uncle, why did you bring me here? Your father, how did he die? Theon blinked. Father. Yes. I heard what your sister said but it's always hard to listen to her. Have to keep reminding myself she's my niece and not for shagging. Might have missed some details. I told him he was a complete failure, threw him in a cell and he hung himself. He hung himself. Yes, he hung himself. By the drowned god. Euron poured more ale, half in the cup and half on his lap. I hated my father. But he hung himself? I never went that far. You're a real Greyjoy, doing in your father like that, drowning him in despair. Abandoning the cup he stood, kicking the table aside to approach his nephew. Uncle Euron. Arms like steel bands closed around Theon, driving the breath from his body. I'm so proud of you. Can't breathe. Need an agent. Herc. The door opened and Euron turned to look. Theon gasped and took a deep breath. I'll just leave you alone, a familiar voice said. The door closed and latched. The boom squid blinked. Sansa. Wait, Sansa, hell. Uncle hugs. Oh make, the white wines are blowing I'm getting too old for this shit. Brynden the Blackfish Tully didn't sigh in relief when he sat down only because the dignity of his house demanded he show not the slightest sign of weakness in front of the assembled nobility of Westeros, no matter how comfortable the padded chair was. He was getting old though, sad to say. Back in his prime, he could drink twice as much as he had last night, shake it and off charge into battle with the best of them the next morn. With that said, he was proud to note he could still hold his own where and when it counted. He couldn't quite remember whose idea it had been to challenge those disrespectful kids, who had boasted that the old men couldn't hold their drink anymore, last night, but he did remember he as well as Lords Umber and Karstark had remained standing, shoulder to shoulder, badly shouting drinking songs with several hundred of their bannermen in a crowded tavern in the bad part of King's Landing while Ed Muir, the ladies Manderly, Torrhen Karstark and a couple of Freys, seven knows which ones. But was there really a difference, had to be dragged back to their rooms after utterly failing to keep up. The Red Keep had been half destroyed by the predictably destructive combination of Cersei Lannister's spite and Theon Greyjoy's improvisation. And the still intact and safe sections, such as the throne room, were now filled with small folk willing to stand in line most of the day just for the chance to get their picture taking sitting on that bloody uncomfortable monstrosity called the Iron Throne. Accordingly, the high-level government work of the city and Robb Stark's headquarters had shifted to a large manor near the top of Visonyas Hill, just up from the Street of Steel. It was formerly the joint property of a number of Stormlands houses, although after the Baratheons took power in King's Landing it had fallen into disuse. Repurposed, this grand ballroom was now converted into a makeshift council chamber of sorts, thank the seven, deep enough in the large building that the hammering of the blacksmiths down the road had been reduced to a faint tinkling sound that didn't destroy his somewhat delicate head. A large round table had been placed in the middle, with seats for a good 30 people around it. Along the walls of the room were hundreds of other seats where lesser bannermen, maesters, advisors, and family who had been able to secure a place at this most prestigious of meetings attended at their lord's command. Some page had even dug out from some cupboard the banners of all the great houses of Westeros, shaken them out and hung them from the ceiling, lending an official air to the room. This was the first Council of the North. It was quite overdue, having been planned to take place for some time, but delayed for this reason or another until finally it could be delayed no more. 2/3 of the seats around the table were thus filled by a mixture of Northern and Riverlands lords who were mixed together, the distinction of their different regions all but lost these days under the King of the North and Trident. For this first conference, the king had also invited other realms to send representatives and they had answered without hesitation. First to his far left was a contingent from Dorne, led by Doran Martell himself in a rare appearance outside of Sun's Pair. His daughter Arianne sat beside him at his left and Oberyn to his right with his paramour Elaria, both looking equally beautiful, exotic, and deadly. Behind the Martells sat several dozen men and women from Dorne, a mixture of bannermen from houses Euronwood and Manwoody mostly. But sitting in the front row of this contingent directly behind their father with the subtlety of an artillery barrage were 3 older members of the infamous Sand Snakes. In spite of the formality of the occasion, or perhaps because of it, they had come dressed in matching combinations of tight-fitting leathers and silken cloth that left very little to the imagination. their choice of clothes raising a few eyebrows, among other things. The trio of young women were garnering a great deal of attention in the room, both openly appraising looks from younger men and appalled looks from some of the more stuck-up southern nobility who seemed astonished that Oberyn would bring his bastards with him like this. Clearly, said people had not spent much time around him before today. In either case, the trio seemed to revel in the attention they were getting, and Brynden reminded himself to have a quiet word with Edmure after noting the looks he was exchanging with Obara Sand. His nephew had done a lot of growing up in this war, even gained a measure of deserved fame as Robb Stark's artillery commander-in-chief, but she was not someone his nephew was in any manner equipped to deal with. Next to the Martell delegation were the representatives of the Vale of Arryn, the smallest group of those attending. Only 2 men sat at the table and barely a dozen filled seats behind them, seemingly happy to not be on the table given the cool looks their main representatives were getting. Happily, Littlefinger was not and would never be among them. With Littlefinger dead, he'd checked to make sure, and barely resisted the urge to piss on his bones after hearing quietly from the king and the Greyjoy about just what he was suspected of doing over the years. Lords Yohn Royce and Horton Redfoot had stepped up to represent the Lady of the Eyrie. Something that left them in a bit of a personal quandary. He knew both men well from his years of service in the Vale and knew that they had been seething under the neutrality demanded by his increasingly unstable niece. But here and now with Baelish dead, they were in the position of being honor-bound to support and press her positions as her sworn bannerman. Royce at least had, eventually, been able to get away with almost tokenism acts of defiance such as sending the bastard Maya Stone and a few volunteers to fight the Lannisters, her status as both a bastard and child of Robert justifying this act without censure. But even that was being viewed by many of the lords in the Army of the Trident as little more than a play to push her claim for Storm's End. And Redfoot hadn't even been able to get away with even that much. It truly didn't help that the Westeros despoiler, read by a surprisingly large number of the senior nobility in the Vale, had all but condemned Lysa to her bannerman. Articles had pointedly noted the damning silence from the Vale. That even as the North and Riverlands grappled with the Lannisters who had slain Robert and Eddard Jonaryn's sons in all but name, the vaunted chivalry of the Vale was proving to be worthless as they turned their backs on family and honor. Even Dorne, bloody Dorne, had sent their armies to fight alongside and the Reach had married into the alliance, yet they remained silent. Add to that more than a few hints about the intentions of the former Lord Baelish regarding the widow Arryn that had seemed almost prophetic after he had simply waltzed into the Eyrie like he owned the place to become her closest advisor. The words of the despoiler had struck deeper than any blade ever could, into the heart of the cradle of Andal nobility. And now, with her beloved Littlefinger dead, and loath the man as he did only a fool would not respect his political skill, he feared for her future. She had pushed her bannermen to the absolute limit, their love for the memory of her late husband had been more responsible for their loyalty than their oaths to his widow. And when she had almost gleefully, so he had heard from some friends still back in the Vale, jumped over that memory to embrace and marry Peter Baelish on his arrival from King's Landing. With some difficulty, Brynden pushed his thoughts away from the Vale to focus on the here and now. The next group at the table was not the smallest delegation in size, but it was led by a delegate of the smallest size. Tyrion Lannister and Doran were only leaders of their realms present apart from the king, although that had more to do with the short notice of this meeting than any disrespect from the other realms. The dwarf had run around the Crownlands a few times to see to things, but otherwise seemed to be entirely content to let his uncle rule in Casterly Rock as his regent while he saw to big-picture issues in King's Landing, an arrangement he suspected was simply because he was enjoying himself too much in the center of the whirlwind of politics and intrigue. And the wine. Always the wine. The half-man as he was now called could be found at night seated in taverns filled with northern nobles without anyone even batting an eyelid. Which might not sound like much, but given that said lords would stick a blade in his sister's or nephew's throat without blinking, roaring in triumph perhaps, but not blinking, it was quite remarkable. The despoiler had widely spread talk of his heroism at the Steel Wedding and, most recently, credited him with being a key factor in the success of the mission that had recovered Arya Stark. Add to that the equally widely published heroism of Kevan Lannister's son, a prisoner of the North, who had died saving the life of one of the Karstark's boys, with Karstark himself swearing publicly in print that the North remembers such things, and it was clear that there was an effort underway to start to pull back on the North's bloodlust around the Lannisters and focus it exclusively on Tywin, Cersei, and Joffrey as the cause of all this destruction. Although such efforts seemed unnecessary in the aftermath of the Battle of the Crossroads. The Blackfish had seen the aftermath of many a battlefield, but what was left of the Incest King's host on that day had taken even him aback. 20,000 men, most unsullied to be sure but with plenty of Westerland and Stormland soldiers and knights mixed in, had been butchered by barely 400 of the North's best soldiers, or more honestly, by the massed batteries of artillery and bolters they had brought with them on river monitors, unleashing such a concentration of firepower that even Edmure had been slightly sickened to watch unleashed, slaughtering the Lannisters trapped in the close confines of the village before. The shattered remains were caught in a pincer by the jaws of the wolf closing in on them. Literally in the case of that crazy nephew of his riding his bloody dire wolf through the enemy ranks. It had been the single most destructive battle for an army in Westeros history. Even the Field of Fire, that legendary battle with all three of Aegon Targaryen's dragons unleashed during Aegon's conquest, not even that had killed so many people. Even the most bloodthirsty soldiers among the army of the Trident looking to avenge Eddard Stark had been struck silent upon seeing the aftermath of what happened when the army of the North stopped playing at war and started practicing it, as said by Eddard Shorthand in his special commentary on the battle. A grassy field had been turned into a mud-churned hell covered in corpses, dead horses, and war beasts. The lesson had been driven home to the northern levies when they had been put to work felling entire acres of forest and sorting bodies, starting the grim work of building giant funeral pyres for the unsullied and sorting out the mess of the Westerosi to see if any of them could have their bones returned to their families. All as entire teams of Septons mournfully prayed over the dead. The army of the Trident's loyalty or commitment wasn't in question, mind you. Not even a bit. Brynden could see that their reverence for their king now verged on worship after word had gotten around of his actions. And given the sometimes heated arguments in the camps around the city of exactly how Joffrey would be executed, they were certainly in no way looking to show mercy to the leaders of their enemies. But the icy rage towards the Westerlands had thought to be more pity than hate, at least towards the poor bloody levies. And even some understanding that there were good Westerlanders who didn't deserve to die for the crimes of Joffrey and Cersei. Case in point, sitting next to the new Lord of Casterly Rock was an older but still striking enough woman, one Lady Alice Anne Lefford from the Golden Tooth. It was all but an open secret that the Golden Tooth was to be annexed formally into the Riverlands. It had always been an ideal point for the Lannisters to launch attacks into the Riverlands, and now it was to be part of the war guild the Lannisters were willing to pay to end the war on good terms. To that end, and with her husband sometime dead, it seemed the Lady Lefford had her eyes set on a dynastic match, to marry herself into the Riverlands nobility directly. And thus, she had come to King's Landing to, in a matter-of-fact way, find herself a husband, and had been moving through the Riverlands camps around the city like a lioness on the prowl. He personally pitied whoever was granted the honor of that position. The boom squid had made it clear that she had balls the size of cannon shells, and if she set her sights on someone, the odds of them escaping were slim to none. Taking the warning seriously, he had been careful to keep his distance. He had had enough of that marriage shit from his brother. Still, what problems the Westerlands had going forward, they were as nothing compared to the issues the Stormlands had. Brynden shifted his gaze further along to look at that part of the table, or, more precisely, their parts of the table. He could see at least 4 different factions sitting there, all looking rather unhappy to be sitting next to each other, and their delegations behind them were even more pointed in their sulking and glaring. Sir Davos Seaworth, the former advisor to Stannis Baratheon and now nominal regent of the Lady Shireen Baratheon, was seemingly the official leader of the region, apparently having Robb Stark's tacit support, but looked mighty uncomfortable to be sitting in this room, given the cold stares some gave the former chief advisor to the Kinslayer, as Stannis was being called now. Next to him was Maya Stone, Robert's grim-looking bastard, who was clearly still trying to press her own claim for Storm's End, along with 1 or 2 other lords he didn't know representing other local factions, including apparently another of Robert's bastards. In normal times, the blood claim of the 2 bastards would be as nothing next to that of the true-born daughter of Stannis, but then these were hardly normal times. Varys had already brought word and warnings that chaos seemed on the verge of breaking out across the Stormlands. Comparatively untouched by this war as it was, a huge swathe had been cut through its knights, lords and levies. First, the Lannisters at King's Landing had torn the massed armies of Stannis to pieces during his attempt to take the city. Then, after Stannis had found himself blockaded by the North's Royal Navy on Dragonstone, many of the surviving families had pledged their loyalty back to Joffrey. Most of those families' best had charged into Ed Muir's cannons at the crossroads and been obliterated, leaving far too many houses without their leaders and heirs, little more than children, if they had them at all. In short, there was an absence of power and authority. And if in such an absence even bastards could start to gather attention and support. Already there were whispers that the Reach and Dorne were contemplating the possibility of taking border fiefs. Brynden didn't think even Mace Tyrell would try anything so stupid as an invasion and risking the wrath of the king in the north, or worse, his mother and daughter. More likely they would start to put quiet pressure on border houses with bribes or threats under the table, to get them to bend the knee to Sunspear and Highgarden, of their own choice. Which might not even be so hard. Banditry was starting to pick up as deserters, sellswords looking to recover their pay, and even desperate refugees all took matters into their own hands. So too had houses that still had manpower chosen to take the unique chance to settle old grudges with houses far more wounded in the war. Even the most petty things like boundary disputes between lords had rumors swirling of small skirmishes already starting. Trade and commerce already disrupted by the war were starting to grind to a halt, and it wouldn't be terribly long before something started that would cascade into a full-scale brawl. It seemed only a strong firm response from this council could still the stormy waters of those lands before things became impossible to control or contain. Yet he knew Robb was loath to get involved. It had been long a saying that the Starks didn't belong in the south, and given the revelations from the far north, that went double now. But, if not him, then who? It was darkly amusing to him in its own way. Joffrey, Renly, Stannis, perhaps even Littlefinger, had all desperately desired the throne and been denied it violently. And here, his nephew was doing everything he possibly could to stay away from becoming the king of the 7 kingdoms, except that said 7 kingdoms, or at least most of them, were firmly trying to push him into the position regardless of what he wanted. Past the Stormlands delegations came the second largest group after the North and Riverlands, the group from Highgarden. Headed by Loras Tyrell himself, flanked in turn by the imposing figures of Randall Tarley and Pakester Redwine the General and Admiral of the hosts of the Reach respectively. The Florents, very noticeable by their absence in the front row, had been exiled to sit with lesser houses and representatives behind. A slap in the face and a sign of how tenuous their position had become in the Reach. They had backed Renly along with the Tyrells, but had then switched to Stannis while the rest of the Reach had been called back to align with the North. His wife was a Florent to be fair. The two houses had not come to blows over the matter, but the Tyrells were clearly making an example out of their rivals for control of the Reach and putting them into their place. He doubted very much that Loras Tyrell had thought of that, more likely than not his sister had arranged it. He liked his nephew's wife, but he didn't forget for a second that she had learned under her grandmother's tutelage. Well hidden as they may be, this northern rose had thorns and remembered as readily as a northern woman that the Florents had sided with the man who had murdered her first husband. Some days he supposed it was good to be queen. Still, just as visible as who was at the table, that was, to be honest, really a grand council, was who wasn't at the table. The Iron Islands had not been invited, they seemed too busy encouraging Westeros to come up with a permanent solution to their culture as they expanded their reaving against the Westerlands and Reach. There were also no representatives from Essos in the room. He knew the Iron Bank and the Sea Lord had wanted their representatives to attend, but they had been politely but firmly turned away from this morning with the word that this was for Westerosi only. Although in truth the Sea Lord's embassy had been turned away with a not terribly subtle comment about the curiously familiar technology in the Breve sea sail ship in the harbour. And the Iron Bank's representatives, well, he could care less about them fretting and worrying about if the Commonwealth would even acknowledge the debt of the Iron Throne. Let them fucking stew for a while longer. With a loud thump, the main door into the ballroom opened and he and the rest of the lords stood. Unheralded and without any fanfare, the king in the north and Trident marched into the room dressed in a typically stark grey cloak and leathers, with just a splash of colour in a simple gold band of a crown, probably that his wife and mother had insisted he wear. Said wife was marching with him step for step holding his hand, dressed in an impeccably chosen gown that somehow enhanced her regality while embracing the more astute fashions of the north, done in greens and greys. Behind them came Cat and, of course, the Boom Squid, the two of them leading a cluster of advisors, including, to his annoyance, the fucking eunuch. He trusted the man who was no man about as far as he could throw him. His nephew assured him they had plans to bring his network under the control of others and tightly constrain him, but he scoffed at the notion that anyone could trust Varys or even know what his true motives were. You'd had better luck training a snake to dance than getting the spider's loyalty, he thought with a silent snort. Should have just killed him and been done with it. Please, sit. Robb gestured and the assembled masses returned to their seats as Captain Tarth posted her men and moved up to stand grimly behind the two monarchs' chairs. Seven hells, did that woman ever smile? Robb in a gallant fashion pulled the chair out for his queen as the various people sat down. Only Cat and the Greyjoy had seats for them at the table, the rest of his party joining the aides and others directly behind the king. He smiled at Cat and received a tired one back as she sat down next to him. His other niece had one daughter back now, which should have been cause for celebration, and to be fair, at first he had thought they were going to need one of the Greyjoy's toys to pry her arms from around area after she found her waiting with her brothers at the docks. But another of her daughters had vanished and been taken even further away, in the hands of a desperate, spiteful woman with little to lose. Brandon Stark, despite all the best efforts of Winterfell and the remaining bannermen in the north, was still missing without a trace. And despite the fury the north had unleashed in his name, her husband was still dead and would never come back to her. But for all that, he was proud to see her set herself, straighten up and in moments once again become every inch the wife of the late Ned Stark as her son started to speak. My lords, my ladies, thank you for coming. Robb opened the proceedings. A little over a year ago, I called the banners to Winterfell, when word arrived by Raven that my father... He paused for a second as his voice wavered, his wife reaching over to take his hand in hers and offer a supporting smile he seemed to draw strength from. Seriously, who wouldn't? The woman was bloody gorgeous. That my father, he continued in a strong voice after squeezing his wife's hand, had been arrested on charges of treason. All of us knew it was a lie, that my father would never have turned against a man who was his brother by all but blood, he said, and gained an immediate response as various lords spat and cursed the name of Joffrey in support of his statement, stopping only when Robb held up a hand. With that news came a demand of submission, left unsaid, that my father and sisters would pay the price if I did not bend the knee. On that day it became clear that, like the Mad King before him, King, and the Blackfish allowed him to be impressed at the sheer level of contempt his nephew had put into that word, Joffrey cared not for the law or our rights. Only for total, complete, and absolute submission to his whims. He paused for a moment before looking him, his face set. My grandfather was known to say to his children that they should never start any fights, but if they ever did get into a one, to win. My lords and ladies, Joffrey started this fucking war, we have finished it. This time the approval from the room was enthusiastic. Roars and cheers thundered in the room, and he did wince slightly at the noise level even as he and others pounded their fists on the table. In no time at all chants of the king in the north and trident, were ripping through the room. Rob let them go on for a short time, before holding up both his hands and letting them fall off. With the war over, I had hoped today to talk of peace. To sit down with goodwill and forge a new future for Westeros free of the shackles of the Iron Throne. I still hope this, but... He paused for a moment, seemingly setting himself, before pushing on. But I must inform you now of events in the north. And while I hope, I truly hope, for today to be the start of a new era, everything from this point, my lords and ladies, must be viewed through the truths of this news and what it means for all of us. In that moment, Brynden was struck by just how much Rob looked like his father as he looked around the room with a grim but determined expression. And it struck him there that like Rickard Stark, Eddard had been robbed of living to see his son become a man any father would be fiercely proud of. What we discuss from this point forward does not go outside your most trusted bannerman, the Queen added as her husband gathered himself, her gaze calm, yet with an edge in it no less sharp than Rob's. We cannot afford to have news of this get out before we're ready, because a panic especially among the small folk is the last thing we need and could doom us all. Now the uneasy sort of mood in the room started to shift towards one of genuine alarm. Even the hungover kids looked alert and attentive now. When the king and queen in the north with more power than any Westerosi monarchs ever had started talking about news so dire that it might cause a panic. The words of my house, Rob started after a moment, as I'm sure you all know, our winter is coming. Legend has it they were chosen by Brandon the Builder, the first Stark, to remind us that even the longest summer always gives way to winter and to be prepared. Now, Rob's hands slowly tightened into fists. It would seem that the words once held meaning far beyond that, but much of what was once known to the first men has been lost to us. Over thousands of years history has become legend, and legend has become myth. Thus, I would ask you to hearken to the words of Maester Luwin, who I have put in charge of consolidating all our intelligence and information on this situation. We will give you all hard copies of your own, but for now I simply ask you to listen. Rob now sat as his maester. The old but highly respected Luwin stood and moved to stand in a small gap next to the king, as his assistants started to move around the room, placing in front of each person at the table an information packet in a folder, secured with a wax seal. One with very bright red letters saying most secret, a theatrical gesture perhaps, but hopefully one that made the point clear. Over the last 2 years, Winterfell has been receiving reports from the Night's Watch of unusual activity north of the wall. The maester started now that the mood had been appropriately set with just the right amount of unease. Wildlings were gathering together in larger and larger numbers. At last report before events in the south overtook us all, they were a force 100,000 strong and growing. Unified under a king beyond the wall named Mance Rayder, a deserter from the Night's Watch. There's only ever been 6 or 7 of these kings beyond the wall in all of history. Great Jon Umber spoke up in a low growl that gained attention at once, his massive beaded face and sunken eyes moodily staring into the center of the table. Unlike most of the lords, he knew what was really going on. And while he was not happy about the king and lord commander's decisions, he had understood and accepted them once the situation was laid out for him. None have ever had an army near this big, let alone led so many different tribes who hate each other's guts. Following a crow? It's almost too hard to believe. Loyalty in a wildling is almost a contradiction. And while they are fierce, I doubt they are stupid. A new voice cut in and attention on the table shifted to the ever grim and calculating face of Randyll Tarly, who was staring at the far wall in a considering sort of way as he rubbed his chin in thought slowly, his hard face giving nothing away as he thought out loud. This many factions would never follow a deserter of the watch unless he was able to offer them, all of them, something they all wanted more than his head. Frankly, I can see only one thing that could be so valuable that they would all agree to follow him to get it. Riches. Some bannerman of House Manderley hazarded, earning a look of irritation from Tarly that had the other slink back into his seat trying to look small. Survival, he corrected the other bluntly, turning to focus in on the maester who nodded slowly. Your insight is keen, Lord Tarly. Luwin offered him a brief bow as a ripple of whispers and low comments circled the room. We did not see this truth at first. The reports we got from the Night's Watch were somewhat circumspect as they themselves were only slowly piecing together a larger picture. Wildling villages found entirely abandoned. Trackers finding animals moving atypically through the haunted forest, or their presence vanishing altogether as if reacting to something unseen. A number of well-armed, well-trained ranger teams going missing without any evidence of how or why. And at night, observers using advanced farcers of Theon Greyjoy's personal design saw from the Shadow Tower what could only be truly massive fires deep in the Frost Fangs at night. Tracks and scattered sightings from patrols showing all wildlings moving as one towards the source of those fires. In short, the Night's Watch found they had too many questions, too few answers, and Lord Commander Mormont, and he glanced at Mage for but a moment, decided to lead a personal reconnaissance mission. A great ranging hundreds of men strong, equipped with the finest weapons and technology the North boasted, in the hope of getting some answers. And I am taking it, they found much more than they bargained for. Tyrion Lannister quipped as if this was all some amusing story in a bar. In a manner of speaking, Rob looked steadily at the other until his somewhat sardonic smirk vanished, before directing his gaze around the room. Under a Myrish flag after a skirmish, Lord Mormont and Mance Rayder met to talk. And in that talk and the events that followed immediately after, it became clear that the king beyond the wall had gotten his position by convincing the wildlings of one simple truth. That either they all reached the wall and managed to get safe passage beyond it, or all of them would be dead by the time winter hit. A new confused murmuring broke out at that before it was quickly stifled as Lord Royce stood. These wildlings, if they are anything like the mountain tribes of the Vale, are not weak people, your grace. No matter how primitive they might be. They have survived for thousands of years in the most inhospitable part of Westeros, with next to no technology or society. Why would the onset of winter terrify them so when they live in one? And why would the North have any concern over them, what with the weapons you and the Night's Watch now have? You are correct, my Lord Royce, winter does not scare them. Rob acknowledged the other with an unblinking stare. They are not fleeing the winter, they are fleeing from what is coming with the winter, as the north winds grow ever stronger. The north winds? Lord Royce asked, seemingly confused, but his response was almost lost as there was a sudden intake of breath and soft profanity from many of the northern lords who were now directing alarmed, disbelieving looks at their king. Then there was a scraping sound and everyone's gaze was dragged to the side as Theon Greyjoy himself slowly stood, letting the scrape of his chair's legs across the floor serve as his herald and silencing all other noise in the room as Lord Royce resumed his seat. Slowly, he traced his for once utterly serious gaze across the room before he started to speak with a chillingly soft tone. The words of House Stark were, I think, a warning of much more than the onset of snow, the boomsquid noted, almost to himself. No one puts up a wall of ice 300 miles wide and 700 feet high on any kind of whim. The wildlings as a people probably came a long time after the wall was built, but we have forgotten that too. I have, been blind and distracted. And in that blindness, a far darker thing than Joffrey Waters has silently moved back into the world, unseen and unchallenged in the darkness of the far north. Biding its time and building its strength until it was ready to start moving. I do not know why they have chosen now as their time. I do not know where they have been for all these centuries, but it seems their defeat was merely a delay, he said, his gaze now lifting to slowly run around the room and seemingly drop the temperature from the horrible look of utter sincerity in his eyes as he spoke the words. Words that would be burned into many a person's mind, now and forever. Winter is not coming, my lords and ladies, winter is here. And we now have proof that the White Walkers, the others, have returned with it and are coming for us all. There was a moment of perfect, utter silence and stillness as everyone took in the truth that had been laid out before them, then took in the utterly and deadly serious expression on the usually cheerful and sardonic boomsquid's face. Then the room exploded into noise as every person started to shout at once. Oh make, the white winds are blowing PT2. It took some time for order to be restored among the most powerful men and women in Westeros. Marjorie Tyrell spent much of that time patiently sitting and observing the reactions to the Greyjoy's announcement, feeling and listening as she had been painstakingly taught by her grandmother. Dozens of conversations had broken out across the room, blending into noisy and somewhat rambunctious exchanges that were edging towards panic at the idea that monsters of legend were both real and coming for them. Less so on the southern half of the room, true, but even there only a few people Valder Frey primarily seemed to be openly wearing expressions of disbelief. Most of the Reach at least were following the lead of her brother, who was looking as serious as he could, and slightly ridiculous. She made a mental note to talk to him about trying to look too much like Tywin Lannister, as they seriously discussed it. Tyrion Lannister had a perfectly neutral face, but the unconscious tapping of his knuckles in a clenched fist on the table gave away his unease clearly to her. And the Stormlands contingents just looked downright confused as it dawned on them that this Grand Council actually wasn't about them. Strike that, one of their number simply looked grim. Ah, yes. The Onion Knight had, after all, served Stannis. Stannis, who had heard of this threat at the same time as the North, and had used that knowledge to escape his fate. She could not begrudge her husband's decision to let Stannis live and serve on the Wall, seizing the opportunity to end one war quickly and prepare for the next. If nothing else in the days ahead, it would be a useful political tool for her to drive home how all their old wars were now a thing of the past. Stannis was a skilled leader who would no doubt be useful to the Night's Watch in the dark days ahead. But in her heart, she wished she could have extracted some measure of justice for Renly. Stop that! She heard the voice of her grandmother in her mind, so much so she had to fight the urge to look sheepishly over her shoulder, expecting to find the old woman here, glaring at her in disapproval, jabbing her cane at her as she had when she'd dared to raise an objection to the plan to marry her to Robb Stark with Renly's body still warm. Bury the dead and live, girl, we all join them soon enough and they will not begrudge you making them wait. Feeling appropriately chided from the memory, she set aside the past to focus on the present and future, turning to face her husband as she felt his gaze upon her. And she allowed herself the luxury of a full 2 seconds to take in that face that she had missed for so long. His rugged, handsome face, remembering how it looked when she forced herself, with some difficulty, to concentrate. There would be plenty of time for that later tonight. Politics was the order of the day now. Perhaps we went too far? Rob asked her over the din, leaning in close to her so they could talk without shouting. Or be overheard for that matter. No, she replied firmly, keeping half an ear on the arguments raging between various lords and an appropriately grave expression on her face for appearance's sake. We can't risk key lords dismissing our claims because they either don't want to believe it or don't believe us. That's why it had to be Theon. He has impeccable credentials for claiming the impossible as truth and humiliating everyone who bets against him. Rob nodded at that and she continued confidently. We have time to build our alliance, but we won't get anywhere if we're forever fighting a second war against idiots who refuse to admit the others exist until the dead are climbing over each other onto their castles' battlements deep in the south. Rob seemed to consider that as he continued to study her. What? She asked, slightly nonplussed at his intense gaze. Have I told you how beautiful you are today, my queen? He finally said in a low, deep voice. Now she did flush, feeling a surge as the wolf seemed to come to the forefront of her husband's bearing in the low tones of his voice. Propriety be damned. She had a sudden desire from far too many months apart to grab him by his leathers, yank him to her and kiss him like this was his last day. To raise such a scandal that ladies from Winterfell to Sunspear would be gasping and secretly flushing scarlet when they read about the king and queen of the north, Trident and Reach making out like desperate teenagers in front of all the realm's nobility. No. But I'm sure you can correct that tonight, she instead replied with an easy smile that was far more of a smirk, using a sultry tone that caused her husband's nostrils to flare before he too seemed to get a hold of himself and they pulled back and turned to face the room. She took in the noise once more. The arguments didn't seem to be adding any new insights now and accordingly, she turned to catch the eye of Captain Tarth and made a curt hand signal. Brienne nodded back and turned away for a moment. Marjorie set herself carefully, forcing herself to not tense up and brace as. Bang! Bang! The sound of a Viper shotgun discharging its two barrels a half-second apart was quite deafening thanks to the thick stone walls. The vast bulk of the room's guests dove for the floor, more than a few screams of panic and alarm sounding, with the counterpoint thud of the far door being opened rapidly by the guards outside. A quick look at the room and seeing that both she and her husband were fine, then an unseen hand gesture from Brienne and the guards bowed briefly and closed the door again as the queen stood. A brittle sort of silence came into the room, broken only by the gentle pitter-patter as the rock salt that had been loaded into the thunder arm and sprayed into the roof now irregularly rained down on the table, floor, and people cowering under it as they slowly started to look up, their gaze shifting between Brienne and the still smoking shotgun she was holding and their queen scowling down on them. Not everyone outside the royal party was cowering mind. She was impressed to see Lord Bolton had barely raised an eyebrow, Lord Tarley was simply looking faintly amused and the Blackfish was still in his seat massaging his forehead with his eyes squeezed tightly shut. But they were very much exceptions. So she said in a tone she had heard her grandmother use many a time to scold everyone from servants to lords paramount. One with just the right mix of annoyance, contempt, and authority, or so she hoped, as the proud lords started to understand that the world had not ended. The finest lords of Westeros. This is how the greatest soldiers and warriors in the realm react to finding there is an equally great threat that needs to be confronted. She observed with not quite a sigh of disappointment now edging into her voice. She couldn't help but feel slightly amused that Valder Frey was not among those getting off the floor. The red-faced lord of the twins was now furiously glaring at his offspring and bannermen who had all hit the ground without any of them seeming to care to try and protect their lord. Rob stood to join her, his gaze equally unimpressed as he looked at the group stunned into silence by the somewhat violent reminder of the power of the north. If we are all quite finished? He asked before continuing without waiting for an answer. Good. Now, my lords and ladies, we have a significant information to go through regarding this threat before planning our response. Lord Greyjoy has reviewed all the reports from the Night's Watch thus far and will now give you his personal analysis of the situation. Theon. The other nodded as he stood, Marjorie taking that as her key to sit back down as the room almost magically calmed back down and resumed their seats. She idly recalled the saying that when Theon Greyjoy spoke, everyone from Dorne to the Wall listened, and now she saw it for true. Even before he had said one word, the boom squid, the genius had the room's undivided attention simply by standing up. She couldn't help but marvel at that power. Perhaps she was slightly jealous, but if it worked for her now, so much the better. And frankly, he was good at this, quite the storyteller indeed. Despite having read the same reports as he, Marjorie found herself surprised to find she was hanging on his every word. He started with Castle Black. 2 dead bodies found just outside the wall had come back to a twisted form of life to attack the Lord Commander in the middle of the night. Their blue eyes and seeming indifference to being stabbed and struck in ways that would easily kill a man clearly making an impression on the room. He then took them all beyond the wall to places none in this room had ever been, through the haunted forest and dozens of intact yet mysteriously abandoned villages. And finally, the clash of arms at the Fist of the First Men where the army of the wildlings under Mance Rayder had attacked the ranging and been brutally repulsed leading to an uneasy standoff, broken as a massive, unnatural storm had swept in precisely across the region. The ballroom was silent as now as Theon described how out of that mist and thunder, the dead had come. In strength. He quickly shifted through the chaos of the clash and decision to retreat towards the wall, relaying the intention of the Lord Commander to resettle the wildlings, or free folk as they apparently called themselves, behind it. Robb broke in there at the murmurs and dark looks from many of the northern lords to note that while he supported the Lord Commander's decision, he was to be putting in place strict conditions on this generosity he would go into later with the northernmost houses, seemingly mollifying them as he gestured Theon to continue. The Greyjoy did so, noting that all the lords and ladies' folders had detailed analysis from Jon Snow's reports on ways to kill whites and threat they posed. But now, he had reached to the part of the story that had everyone seemingly suddenly shifting forward onto the edge of their seats. Jon Snow confronting one of the ancient enemy themselves. Twice. The first time, he had shot it with a heavy rifle bullet that did unclear damage at night, seemingly driving it off from its position observing the battle, but if nothing else, it certainly seemed to have pissed it off. Given a week later, the walker coming after him specifically taken a moment to pointedly look at a mark on its skin where apparently the bullet had struck it as they had squared off. Theon dryly noted at that point that it seemed that the White Walkers were just as capable as humans of holding a grudge, earning a nervous laugh from the table, before adding that in response to its clear affront to being shot, Jon had simply told it to eat shit and die, and shot it twice more, sending it staggering back. From the more enthusiastic noises and even a few fists pounding on the table from some of the more rough and tumble northern lords that resulted, there was seeming general approval of that action. But the walker had been far from finished, mobbing him with some of its dead slaves to keep him distracted while it recovered, the dead pressing Jon from multiple angles until he had made a fatal mistake of trying to cross his sword with the other as it had suddenly reappeared, only for his sword to block the walker's magical weapon, not shattering like every other weapon used against it. Now, the critical fact to note here is that Jon Snow was not using a normal sword, Theon explained to the intrigued looks of the room. He had been rewarded by Lord Commander Mormont after saving his life at Castle Black with the right to hold and use his family's ancestral blade. Long Clawma Edge Mormont spluttered in some astonishment, flushing slightly as everyone turned to face her, but raising her chin in pride as she realized her family's most valuable possession had just had a new, astonishing page written in its history. The Valyrian steel blade of my house, she explained. As you say, Lady Mormont, Theon inclined his head. It would seem conclusive that whatever magic was infused into Valyrian steel dragon fire would be my guess, at least in part from what I've uncovered over the years. It is still both present and capable of resisting the White Walker's own magic that otherwise immediately destroyed any weapon that struck it. More critically, Jon reported that it seemed genuinely shocked at the outcome, pausing for a moment as if it couldn't believe that had happened before the two of them started really fighting. Jon exchanged a few strikes which he noted as powerful but off balance, saw an opening and stabbed it, at which point the White Walker exploded into shards of ice and snow that sprayed over the area. A powerful cheer rose promptly with yet more pounding on the table, and what sounded oddly like a moan of pain from the direction of the Blackfish, as well as calls of Snow. Snow. Snow, celebrating the fact that a man had proven their new enemy and old enemy could be killed. Marjorie however sighed as she saw her good mother look like she had just bitten into one of her cousin's infamously sour lemon tarts. Apparently the thought of Jon Snow being acclaimed a hero and doing something no living man had ever done in slaying one of the ancient enemy did not agree with her. Frankly, Marjorie thought Catelyn Stark was dangerously irrational around Eddard Stark's bastard. From her careful probing of Theon and Robb about Jon Snow, naturally after marrying Robb she had needed to know if the oldest of Eddard Stark's children was a threat. It had become clear he was Pack. It was actually that simple for once compared to the often chaotic scenes in the Reach around birthrights. And as a sworn brother of the Night's Watch, whatever claim he may have potentially had on Winterfell was now gone. Silently, Marjorie made a note in her head to talk to Robb about this. Jon Snow was clearly thriving on what would soon be the front lines of this war, was the king's brother in a position to exert enormous influence over the Night's Watch. Indeed, Theon had noted he suspected that the current Lord Commander was quite possibly grooming him to be his replacement. They, could not afford any disruption by the Lady Stark. The latest reports from Castle Black, via Winterfell, are that the wildlings are starting to move through onto the gift as we speak. Theon brought her attention back as he moved through several pieces of paper with the latest reports. Luckily, most of the remaining settlements on the gift have been abandoned thanks to Lord Stark's decision to support the Watch more directly in recent times. The exceptions to this are being evacuated by His Grace's order. There should be enough space, game, and materials to settle the wildlings across the gift, with enough room between tribes to keep friction down. However, only about 20,000 have made it to the wall. Which means if things have gone badly, the army of the dead could easily top 100,000 already. That number caused a rumble of chatter to break out across the room as Theon sat down. Theon quantifying their foe had seemingly replaced fear of the unknown with fear of the known for many of the people in the room. Her grandmother had always warned her that fear was the most dangerous of all weapons to try and wield. Fear could drive great things, or terrible things. It could raise an army from nothing or scatter it like seeds on the wind. Fear could build empires just as easily as it rallied others against them. The question now was if they would let fear unite them, or divide them. Given the situation, Robb took back control of the room, quieting the conversations, I am going to be reducing the North's presence in the south, immediately. Lords Karstark, Umber, Glover and Lady Mormont, your banners will be decamping immediately. We'll discuss the logistics this afternoon so we can start them moving tomorrow at sunup, he ordered, getting 4 quick nods in reply as Robb turned his attention to the younger Karstark sitting next to his father. Torrhen, I am appointing you in charge of looking after things on the gift and keeping the situation under control. I want you to work with our people, the Night's Watch and the Wildlings as my representative. Help our guests settle in but make sure they understand the rules. You have my authority and trust to do what needs to be done. Finding out what the Wildlings need to build shelters would be a good first start. The more time they spend trying to build homes, the less they'll think about anything outside of the gift. The younger Karstark's jaw dropped as the realization of what he was being asked to do hit him, until he managed to pull it closed. Why? Your Grace, the other stammered, with all respect. He feels unworthy of this honor but will, of course, do as his king commands to the very best of his abilities. Lord Karstark cut in, giving his son a look. Yes, as my lord father says, your Grace. The younger Karstark quickly agreed and Marjorie spared him an understanding smile that had him blush slightly as Robb nodded and moved on to the next issue. Lord Tyrell, we need to converse about accelerating the rollout of our harvesting methods and technologies into the Reach. This winter is sure to be longer and harder than any for thousands of years and one we will have to fight a war through. We'll need to do whatever we can to shore up our food supply in what time we have left before winter hits. I am at your service, good brother, the other said with a firm nod, and Marjorie smiled at his casual reminder to the room of their house's firm connection to the north. To the rest of Westeros and the other houses of the Reach. Especially the other houses of the Reach. We have some time to prepare. Not much, this damn war has cost us far too much already, but some. Robb continued after a moment's thought. Right now, the best we can do is deny the enemy as many resources as we can while building our own up and denying a fight with them for as long as we can. Why wait? Lord Glover demanded with a scowl. Our armies are fully in the field, fully equipped. Let's hit them hard and hit them now. There was a rumble of both agreement and disagreement at that, an argument quickly building up across the room between those who wanted to attack now and those who were clearly terrified of getting into a war with the ancient enemy anytime before they absolutely had to. My lord's great Jon Umber rumbled to the room before, not getting enough notice. He stood and took a deep breath. My lords, he yelled, shutting everyone else up immediately. Here's what I think about these White Walkers and their army of the dead. And with that, he turned and almost violently spat at the floor, earning a laugh from the Northern and River Lords, a slight smile of remembrance from his king, a bark of laughter from Oberyn Martell and even a smirk trying to fight its way onto the dour face of Tyrion Lannister. Lady Alysanne next to him, however, rolled her eyes in a way that said men, and made Marjorie smile behind a hastily raised hand. 8,000 years ago these fuckers came during the long night. 8,000 years ago, we defeated them. He roared and there was a mumble of agreement from the table. The last time, the first men faced them and pushed them back. You know what they had to do it with. He paused for a moment as he looked around the room. Sticks. 2 sticks and a rock for each tribe. He paused for a fraction of a second to slam his fist down on the table and grin as he repeated one of the private jokes Theon Greyjoy had told him years ago. And they had to share that rock. Now the laughter in the room was less nervous and more boisterous as he looked around in mock outrage, before standing back up and throwing his arms open. They're coming again? Then let them come. This time, we have the Wall. We have the Night's Watch. We have the Andals and the Rhoynar. He stabbed his finger at first the Vale delegation and then the Martells, who seemed to straighten in their seats a little at their inclusion as growing noises of approval started around the room. We have knights and we have steel. He said to more cheers. We have cannons and thunder arms. He added to louder approval, hammering his fist on the table for emphasis. We have wildfire and gunpowder. And now men were starting to again bang their fists on the table in approval, causing the Blackfish to wince again. And we have the fucking boom squid. He finished, causing a loud cheer to roar through the room as attention turned on the slightly surprised-looking Greyjoy as Umber stabbed a finger at him, almost in accusation. Just look at him. He's probably already thought up 3 new ways to kill the fuckers as efficiently as possible. 5 actually, depending how you count, the Greyjoy noted dryly to cheers and more fist-pounding on the table as he also stood, holding up his hands for quiet that he slowly got as Umber sat. Lord Umber is correct, we have far more manpower and weapons than the first men. And Jon's report shows we can fight the dead. But he added as people started to pound on the table. But, there is something we are all discounting. He paused to take a breath with a brief glance at both she and Robb, the later giving him a tiny nod to proceed. Magic. My Lord Greyjoy, I must say I am surprised to hear you of all people say that, a voice objected from the other side of the room almost at once, and attention turned to an elderly maester next to Leyton Hightower, who looked like he would rather be sitting anywhere else as people turned disbelieving expressions on the man. Magic is a dead force in this world, he continued in a tone that almost sounded like it was actually daring to lecture Theon Greyjoy as he stood up. It is the stuff of legends and childish superstition. Just like the White Walkers. Tyrion Lannister snorted derisively. Why don't you go explain it to them? Who knows, they might vanish in a puff of logic if you can prove they don't exist to their faces. There was a distinct snicker and poorly hidden grins around the room at the jab from the Lannister, and a look from Theon to Tyrion best described as hilarious, but unhelpful before he turned his gaze back on the huffy-looking maester. I would agree with you that magic was a dead force in Westeros, or at least the art or ability to use it was, with a few limited exceptions, Greyjoy conceded easily. But just because we can't wield it doesn't mean others and the others can't, Maester. Rolf. Maester Rolf, he supplied, sounding just a tad taken aback that he wasn't immediately recognized. The authorized representative of the Citadel in the absence of a Grand Maester, he finished, breaking his gaze with Theon to shoot a look at Tyrion Lannister, who seemed entirely unapologetic over the implied complaint over Grand Maester Pycelle being put to work shoveling shit out of the stables at Castle Rock. Marjorie also noticed the way more than a few of the other maesters around the room rolled their eyes or exchanged glances with each other over his pronouncement, and she made a second note to talk to Lord Hightower soon. She had always gotten on well with him, and no lord knew more about the interior politics of the Citadel than he. A power struggle inside the Citadel could be a useful thing, if harnessed correctly, to shake up that institution to get it ready for the war to come. Maester Rolf. The White Walkers are magical creatures, this is simply a statement of fact based on observation. We've seen other events too, Renly Baratheon's death by a creature of shadow and darkness being the most high profile. Give me enough bolters, boom squid, and we'll see how long this army of the dead last, magic or no magic. Lord Karstark didn't quite spit, to a murmur of approval in the room. And if the others can manipulate the weather like at the Fist of the First Men? Say they drop a storm on our army, cut visibility down to 10 or 20 meters. Turn on a gale force wind or snowstorm to bury our army. My lords, the only thing we know that can kill another is Valyrian steel, a metal forged with ancient magic, and that's untenable to win a war against them given how few we have. We don't have the children of the forest this time around to provide us their magic. Now, he added, perhaps we won't need it. Perhaps we will blow them all to hell and wipe them out with cannon and sword and fire, but my lords, we've all just seen clearly what happens in a war where one side has an overwhelming advantage in technology. He paused now to stare down the room, rapping his knuckles on the table for emphasis. I do not want to see what happens to humanity if we find ourselves with no counter for magic. The room remained silent as he sat down again. No one seemed entirely eager to find out what one side having an overwhelming advantage in magic might look like on the battlefield. If I may speak, Your Grace. A gruff voice finally asked diffidently. Robb gestured his agreement, and the Onion Knight stood, ignoring the looks from Maya Stone and the other Stormlander factions around him. While in service of His Grace Stannis Baratheon, I spent much time, not by choice mind, around the Red Woman. The priestess of our Hiller Melisandre. The woman who made that thing that killed Renly. Margaery couldn't help but think as she stiffened, causing Robb to glance at her in concern for a second before she controlled herself. Chiding herself for so openly losing control, she smiled at him and turned back, shooting a look at her brother, who in turn looked ready to leap out of his chair. A glare reinforced with a hand gesture caused him finally settle back into his seat and control himself before she turned to face the man. To clarify, Sir Davos, she spoke up, hoping her bearing remained calm and in control. This is the woman who created that shadow monster which murdered Renly. The other seemed to hesitate before setting himself and plunging in. Your Grace, yes, I saw her give birth to that thing, and I'll have nightmares for the rest of my days. He shook his head as if trying to purge the memory. But I saw her do other things too. Things that I cannot explain away as simple tricks or murmury. She did tell me that her magic, all magic, was growing stronger, for the first time in decades, perhaps centuries. She seemed to think that the red comet in the sky had been a sign of something changing, that it was as if magic had been reborn into the world on that day. I can't speak to that, but I can speak to her, he said, looking directly into Robb's face without flinching. Your Grace, with respect, if these are the people you were thinking of going to, I must beg you to reconsider. They serve no interests except their own. Nothing good can come of them and their magic, and it demands prices that no man should ever pay. There was a rumble of agreement and nods around the room, and with that, Sir Davos had gone from a barely tolerated interloper into someone who spoke sense, to the clear dissatisfaction of other factions from the Stormlands as he sat back down. Well said, Sir Davos. Robb now nodded to him. I agree, the followers of the Red God cannot be trusted. If Melisandre ever shows back up, she'll have a great deal to answer for. But, it is not her or her Red Priests that I am thinking of approaching. He paused to straighten up with his most authoritative bearing then. It was a good look for a king, confident and determined, but Margaery could tell that Robb was really just bracing himself for what he was about to say, knowing it was going to generate controversy. She herself was not exactly convinced, but she trusted Robb and knew a united front was going to be critical going forward. So she would damn well sell it like she was entirely convinced. Some of you may recall there was an argument between King Robert and my father during his time as Hand of the King regarding Daenerys Targaryen, sister of Viserys, the so-called Beggar King. She had been married off to a Dothraki warlord by her brother, who was hoping to gain an army in return. Well, shit happened, as my brother would say. He noted with a glance at Theon, earning a titter around the room, and her brother and husband died and his army dispersed. She fled with a few retainers into the red wastes of Essos, and that seemed to be the end of that. Until, right about the time that comet showed up in the sky, she walked back out of the red wastes and arrived at the gates of the city of Karth, with 3 young dragons. There was an immediate reaction of noise and alarm at this as everyone started to speak at once. Robb held his hands up and tried to calm people down without much luck, so Margaery turned and with a gesture Captain Tarth stepped forward, unsubtle, readying her viper. As if to prove magic did exist, everyone promptly shut up. Your Grace. Lord Royce was first to get a word in the tense silence as he stood again, his face astonished and even slightly angry. Are you suggesting that we try to negotiate with the last of the Targaryens? The Rune Lord asked with uncharacteristic bluntness. A Targaryen in possession of 3 dragons as her ancestor when he conquered Westeros. Yes and no, Robb replied with equal directness. Understand, he added, meeting the heated gazes around the room directly and unflinchingly, his eyes seeming to force people back into their seats they had half risen from. I am not suggesting we entertain any thoughts of offering her the Iron Throne or bending the knee. But, stop to think of what could be? If Valyrian steel is effective against these creatures, I'd think that Valyrian dragons would be even more destructive. Given the sheer number of dead bodies the others could raise against us and the fact that fire seems to be very effective against the army of the dead. He left the thought hanging, and Margaery could see that at least a few people were pushing past their initial reaction to at least consider the possibilities of unleashing dragon fire against their new enemy. Not enough though. Or at least not enough able to see past it being unleashed on them. She sighed softly. It appears we will need to do this the hard way then. Your Grace, I was there that day in the Vale when news came of your grandfather and uncle. Royce continued with genuine passion in his voice. This was clearly something personal to him. I read the letter from the Mad King gloating over his murder of your kin, praising his son's kidnapping of your aunt and demanding Lord Arryn turn over both your father and Robert Baratheon be executed next. I fought proudly with them to finally free ourselves of their madness once and for all. To bring them back. My king, with the greatest of respect, now interjected Lord Hornwood, standing as well, the Rune Lord has the right of it. We cannot trust a daughter of the Mad King. Her father was mad. Both her brothers were mad. That entire family is cursed by the gods, and so is she. We do not need to. And then there again was the sound of a chair sliding back, and Theon Greyjoy was on his feet, a surprisingly irritated look on his face as he, to Margaery's alarm, drew his pistol, causing everyone to cringe away. Then he slapped it onto the polished table and with a hard shove, sent it spinning and skipping across the surface in defiance of everything he had taught her about gun safety, to be caught by the very surprised-looking Lord Hornwood. Well, let's get it over with then, shall we? He declared. Get what, my lord? The other stuttered, his gaze jerking back and forth between the polished silver revolver and Lord Greyjoy in no small amount of confusion and alarm. Executing me, of course, the other said almost cheerfully, causing many an eye to bulge for a second. Not hers though. She fought back the urge to roll her eyes. It seemed her good brother by another mother was going to be dramatic. As if he could do anything else. But why would I possibly? The beleaguered Hallease Hornwood asked, and Theon shrugged seemingly indifferently, but his eyes were sharp and sardonic as ever. Well, let's see. He raised a hand and started to count with his fingers. My father was an oath-breaker many times over, obsessed with his iron way. My brothers were all just as bad. My uncle is absolutely crazy, although if it's a high-functioning cray-cray, who knows? More than a few people think my sister is about as trustworthy as a sword without a handle. I mean, if you are saying we should judge children by the action of their parents and siblings and not their actions, then you really should shoot me dead now, given what House Greyjoy has done, right? Only good Greyjoy is a dead Greyjoy, just like the only good Targaryen is a dead one, right? Theon Robb stated, giving his brother a look. Theon sighed but obediently sat back down, his point made as Lord Hornfoot awkwardly passed the revolver to a guard and sat back down, looking just a little deflated at the blunt rebuke. Lord Roy slowly following after a second's hesitation. My father Robb continued firmly into the moment, as Hand of the King was commanded by King Robert to kill Daenerys Targaryen, the dragon spawn as Robert called her. He refused. Robb stabbed a finger onto the table for emphasis with each word. He told the king, his all-but brother, that it was wrong to kill a woman who had not done him or the Seven Kingdoms any harm, and went so far as to resign his position when Robert refused to bend on this matter. Despite everything House Targaryen had cost House Stark, she had not proven herself his enemy, and so he refused to be party to her murder. He paused for a second and directed that look around the room with an intensity that made her shiver slightly. I am not Joffrey, my lords. I will not declare someone my enemy or judge them based on what someone else did. Only what they did. And so far, she had done nothing to us. Marguerite shivered slightly at the sheer power in her husband's voice and the look in his eyes as he met the eyes of those who had been protesting to see if any would challenge him on this. None could meet his gaze and glanced away. A few even had the dignity to look ashamed at their previous outrage. Your Grace, a new voice joined in, and Marguerite managed to not shiver as she turned to look into the dead eyes of the Lord of the Dread Fort. She had gotten used to Ramsay Snow, but his father's gaze still made something in the back of her mind shiver whenever she met it. Lord Bolton Robb nodded, his calm restored. While I appreciate your refusing to judge her an enemy without her declaring against us, neither has she done anything for us or shown loyalty to Westeros. Given her brother was obsessed with the idea of retaking the Iron Throne, I would suggest that caution is at the least warranted in approaching her, he said, earning a murmur of agreement from the room. Accordingly, I must ask, what do we know about this woman? A fair question, Robb agreed easily, turning now to glance behind him. At the unspoken signal, Varys stood with a whisper of his robes, shuffling to the edge of the table and offering bows to the royalty and nobility with a practiced smile that ignored the sour looks many of the assembled people gave the spider right back. She supposed a man in his position got used to being disliked. Your Grace, Lord Bolton, my lords and ladies, he expanded his greeting to the room before getting down to business. As his Grace stated, Daenerys Targaryen was, for a time, married to a Dothraki named Drogo. The Beggar King clearly hoped to gain an army in return with which he would seize the Iron Throne. As it so happens, her brother died a few weeks before our tragic civil war broke out. Shortly thereafter, her husband also died from injuries in a battle, leaving her alone. As per Dothraki custom, his warband broke apart and she was left with but a handful of followers, 24 perhaps at most. It was known she had been gifted 3 dragon eggs at her wedding, thought to be only useful as status symbols given that no one has hatched dragons for so long. Clearly, somehow, she found a way and arrived with 3 very small but quickly growing dragons at Karth. There she procured a ship and sailed to Slavers Bay, specifically the city of Astapor. She went to deal with slavers. Lord Karstark exclaimed. Figuratively, but clearly aghast and directing an incredulous look at his liege that said without saying, and you want to invite her back? A look duplicated on a great many others' faces in the room. The Lannisters selling northern men and women into slavery was still an insult that seethed through not only the north, but all of Westeros. News of Tywin Lannister descending to such levels had frankly done as much to ruin his reputation after the steel wedding as the bullets fired by the assassins under Guest Right. Robb, however, remained perfectly calm as the spider moved to explain. Yes and no, Lord Karstark, the spider smiled thinly. By the accounts I have, confirmed by multiple sources, she approached the good masters, rulers of Astapor and slavers to a man, with a deal. One of her dragons in exchange for an army of Unsullied, the last of the army intended for Tywin Lannister that was unable to be shipped to him before the war ended. The exchange was made, and she kept her agreement to the letter. It was just that the dragon promptly burned alive those trying to control it, and her army of Unsullied were now loyal to her, meaning when she told them to kill every good master and slaver in the city while freeing every slave. He offered a helpless shrug. Marjorie raised an eyebrow at that as a considered muttering passed through the room, fighting off the urge to shake her head in exasperation at the stupidity of these good masters. She had heard of the Unsullied and their inhuman discipline. An absolute obedience to their commander. Given that, what kind of an idiot would you have to be to hand over control of them? Inside your city, fools would hand over control of their entire army in such a fashion? It would be like taking considerable coin from some bandit in exchange for her pistol and being surprised when said bandit promptly shot her and took the coin back. Marjorie forced herself to concentrate back on the spider's report as he talked briefly about the aftermath of the events. And with a stable government in place, she marched her army, now an army of free men who choose to fight alongside her, on the other 2 cities in the Bay, Yunkai and Mirian. She liberated them in turn, again executed the slavers and put the slaves in charge as she started to work of rebuilding their cities into something new. She is now known as the Mother of Dragons and Breaker of Chains. Well, I've always said it's good to have a hobby, Tyrion Lannister quipped into the silence as Varys finished. Clearly the taken aback lords and ladies who had certainly not expected to hear that the last dragon had started a campaign against slavery of all things. But it sounds like she has her hands full running her own little empire over on the other side of the world. We would be asking her to drop all that and come back to Westeros. Would she be willing to do that? That is the question, Robb agreed. Tyrion studied him for a moment. What then, do you propose, Your Grace? Your sister, Robb responded bluntly, took my sister before we could stop her. The last information we have is that she may have been heading for Slavers Bay. That army Daenerys took was originally intended for Tywin as his final last shipment of Unsullied slaves. If she did go to the Bay, it's likely both of them have been captured by Daenerys. And hopefully, the prisoners your father sold into slavery are also there somewhere. Marguerite saw a subtle flinching in the face of Tyrion, at the reminder of his family's crimes against the North, and especially the Starks. Good, he should understand just how much his position was reliant on Stark goodwill right now, and how much more would be needed to keep this seat at this table. I have 6 hand-picked ships finishing preparations to sail in Blackwater Bay, Robb continued. I had intended to send them to find my sister and the other northerners and bring them home, but given the events we've just heard of. He paused and plunged ahead. What I propose, my lords, is that we use the opportunity to also send a representative to Slavers Bay to negotiate with Daenerys. Hopefully we'll find our people alive and well at the same time. We use the chance to make contact, explain the situation and offer her a deal to come back to Westeros and fight the others with us. You almost make her sound like a common sellsword, Your Grace. Prince Doran spoke up for the first time, well, in a very long time. The Prince of Dorne had all but cut off communication with the rest of the kingdom since Robert's rebellion. Marjorie knew, seeming to be content to sulk over the events of the sake of King's Landing until finally all the people response had died. Robert gored to death. Tywin Lannister mysteriously falling from the Tower of the Hand to his death. The mountain that rides shot to pieces, stabbed and then tackled by a dire wolf before finally falling to his death. And Amory Lorch who had mysteriously died at Harrenhal. Still she knew not to underestimate him. Rumor had always dogged him that he had never truly reconciled himself to the Baratheon dynasty and secretly still saw them as usurpers. Theon himself, in that annoying "I know something you don't know" way of his, had all but outright confirmed he had information from somewhere that Doran had long planned to support the beggar prince, when the time was right. Said prince was of course dead, but now they were all talking about bringing his sister back. On the other hand, his desire to support the dragons was surely born out of revenge for his dead sister, but now all those responsible directly or indirectly for her death were dead. Curious he would speak up now. As the last of the Targaryens, Doran continued calmly, Daenerys most probably views herself as the only true and right queen of the Seven Kingdoms. And thus, desires the Iron Throne. She can have it. Umber snorted. Pictures are 10 pennies, 50 if you want it framed, but the line is pretty long, he snarked, causing a brief ripple of laughter around the room. Marjorie knew he wasn't kidding about the line. Small folk across all of King's Landing and beyond were lining up to the point that Sir Bronn was having to deploy a number of the gold cloaks to keep the line under control and calm. Merchants, always one to see the chance to make a quick penny, were moving up and down the line selling refreshments. It was slightly surreal to Marjorie, the Iron Throne now little more than a tourist attraction. But on reflection she decided it was quite a shrewd move by Robb. This denigration of the Iron Throne in front of the entire population of King's Landing helped to ensure no one would ever see it as the center of power in Westeros ever again. The point, Doran continued after shooting Lord Umber an annoyed look, is that if we are not going to offer her the rule of the Seven Kingdoms, what can we offer her that she may settle for instead in exchange for her aid? I propose Dragonstone, Theon put in before expanding on his point at the interested looks he got. Stannis has already left with most of the nobility left on the island. We're going to need to put someone in charge there anyway. It was the Targaryens' home long before the Seven Kingdoms was formed, so why not just give it back and kill two birds with one stone? Marjorie blinked. What an odd turn of phrase. Surprisingly apt though. An elegant idea, the prince noted after an exchange of glances with his brother, who seemed to shrug and offer a nod of approval. Certainly it would seem to be a generous offer on the face of it, and offer her a seat at this table. And when history repeats itself. Maya Stone broke in, her eyes flashing. Aegon launched his conquest from there with 3 dragons. What happens when she gets the same idea? She demanded, and several of the lords, clearly unhappy at the idea, rumbled their agreement. Though many less than the original outburst of anger she was pleased to see. It seemed the against vote was shrinking by the minute. Excellent. In that case her dragons are blown out of the sky and House Targaryen dies, Theon answered in a matter-of-fact way. I've already designed several adaptations to northern weapons to give us effective anti-air artillery capable of protecting both fixed fortifications and field armies. Her dragons may prove to be critical against the others thanks to their magic, and highly effective against massed armies of the undead, but they are simply no longer the threat they were in the past to us given advances in weapons technology. Maya Stone glanced around the room at that, clearly looking for support to continue her arguments, but unsurprisingly found exactly no one willing to challenge Theon Greyjoy on the subject of northern weapons technology. Clearly Maya wanted Dragonstone to remain a Baratheon holding, Marjorie noted, wondering if she had planned to drop her claim for Storm's End in exchange for the island after Robb Stark had seemingly dismissed her request for support in favor of Stannis' trueborn daughter. Too bad for her. Still, she had served the army well enough and could be a valuable ally. She would have to see if they could buy her off with some holdfast in the Crownlands somewhere, get her away from that mess in the Stormlands lest she otherwise decide to take her chances and set off a little war. They were no few small keeps whose lords had died for Joffrey and needed a new family line. So to summarize, Robb retook control of the conversation, a modestly optimistic expression on his face. We will send a representative to present an offer to Daenerys Targaryen. We will return to her the island of Dragonstone and allow her a seat at this table as a lady of the Commonwealth. In exchange, she will raise her dragons against army of the dead. We make also it clear to her that Westeros is beyond the Iron Throne, and beyond her ability to try and conquer. That we are willing to let House Targaryen again be part of the future of Westeros and to allow her to come home, but that we will never bend the knee to her. Agreed. A fair offer, Doran agreed after a pause of consideration, and the other senior lords around the room nodded or mumbled their agreement too in turn. It was a cautious support, but support nonetheless, slightly unsure, but certainly far less unhappy than their initial leaping to conclusions about dragon invasions and fields of fire. But selling it to a young woman who may be convinced that the Iron Throne is her birthright could be a challenge. The prince chose his words carefully. Now there is an understatement, she silently scoffed. Viserys Targaryen had been obsessed with regaining the Iron Throne, how much of that would have rubbed off on her? And if she was stricken with the Targaryen madness, oh well, to live was to risk. The key will be picking the right person to meet with her, Tyrion agreed with a thoughtful look on his face. We need someone with the authority to undeniably speak on behalf of the Commonwealth. Someone senior enough to negotiate if necessary and make the offer stick, and be willing to walk away if no agreement can be reached. To say nothing, he added dryly, of convincing her that the White Walkers, the others, are actually both real and coming for us all. So why not just send the same man who convinced us? Oberyn Martell suddenly spoke up, a smirk on his face as he raised a hand to gesture at a surprised-looking Theon Greyjoy. Margaery successfully fought the urge to laugh at that joke. Theon was many things, wondrous things, with a mind most were convinced was touched by the gods, but this negotiation would take a deft hand. It needed someone with subtlety, patience and... Not a bad idea, Robb agreed, suddenly looking entirely pleased with the idea, in turn causing most of the lords around the table to smile and nod, clearly sure that this was the best idea ever. 07, he didn't think it was a joke. Didn't he just see the man's negotiation tactics of throwing his gun across the room and asking a man to shoot him? On second reflection, she noted that not quite everyone seemed to be enthusiastic about this. She exchanged a glance with Tyrion Lannister, and that one look spoke volumes of what they both thought about this, then shifted to exchange a look with her good mother that said even more, the expression of a woman who had needed to pull him back from blowing up Winterfell far too many times. Finally she dared to look across at Amr Dahan sitting behind Theon, who was currently looking at the floor with her eyes shut, vigorously rubbing her nose where her glasses rested and looking like she suddenly had a major headache at the thought of her master running off on his own, off the leash, to the other side of the world. Well, that settled that then. Men. Always making things so difficult. So. What to do about it? She of course knew better than to publicly disagree or argue with her husband and king in public, that way lay disaster and dissension that was death. Especially given that there appeared to be something of a consensus among the nobility that could not be risked. Theon was going, that was impossible to stop if it had broad support. Support. Ah. That was the answer. Support. Indeed, not a bad idea, she lied through her teeth smoothly with a smile. But I suggest we may need to think bigger than one person. I think our delegation should be made up of several high nobles from across Westeros to support the perception that we speak to her as one commonwealth. To make it clear to Daenerys that she will not be able to play us against each other or hope for support from part of the realm. We need to make her understand this is her only option to return home in peace and be welcome among us, and to confirm that they are all convinced the threat is real, she firmly declared, earning a thump of fists on the table from many lords at that. To that end, I nominate that we also send Lord Tyrion Lannister to assist Lord Greyjoy. Tyrion blinked at that. Then he blinked again. Then he glanced at her, Robb, Theon and, she thought perhaps Varys, given the way his eyes shifted to focus behind her for just a moment. I am, honored at the vote of confidence, he said slowly, his eyes shrewd. I'm not sure I am the person you would want, however, given the historical tensions between my family and House Targaryen. From the stories I have heard, you and that sellsword friend of yours were confronted with dozens of Vale tribesmen on your way back from the Vale of Arryn, she countered smoothly, knowing that these stories had been spread far and wide in the bars and taverns of King's Landing. By all accounts you should have been killed where you stood, instead you talked them into working for you and escorting you back to your father. You have shown a remarkable ability to think on your feet and a shrewd political mind, she complimented him, getting a series of nods around the table. Dwarf he may be, but no one with any brains doubted his political instincts and skills. And while you are of course not obligated to go, she said, to make sure he would feel he had no choice but to go now, I feel that you would be of enormous value. As much as anything else, it would show to the last Targaryen that we speak as one, which would be a powerful message. It would, he agreed slowly before glancing across the table and smiling slightly. Which is why I accept your request and nominate as the final member of our party Prince Oberyn Martell. After all, he added slightly sardonically to the surprised whisper of noise at that suggestion, having someone who fought on the other side of Robert's rebellion for her family, standing with us, would be a powerful message as well, would it not? The Red Viper raised an impeccably trimmed eyebrow at that, turning to glance at his brother, who after a moment's consideration, nodded his consent, causing the younger brother to grin broadly and slap his hands in glee. Now this sounds like it could be fun, he chortled. Or at least the start of a bad joke. A Greyjoy, Lannister, and Martell walk into a Targaryen bar. XCVI, new page, part 1. AC 300, King's Landing, Westeros. Theon. My temporary office hadn't had a lot, mind you. But standing here made me think about how far away I was from home. How far away I was from everything I'd ever built. How far I was from where I thought the fight was supposed to happen. I looked around at the crates full of gear, books, and equipment. I bent down and sniffed the papers of one of the stacks. I shook my head. Thien. I looked over at the door entrance. Amrita was standing there, a clipboard in her hands. Her hair was up in an elegant bun and she wore a gorgeous blue dress with a jacket. I sighed and rubbed my temples, looking back at the crates. Hey, I said. Preparations complete. Nearly, Amrita said. She sucked in a breath. Much of the equipment you asked for will be shipped onto the Seawolf. The Venture will carry the other supplies. It's all on the list. She handed over the clipboard. I took it, my hands holding onto her. She looked up, her eyes meeting mine. I squeezed her hands together, and smiled warmly at her. She was so pretty, even as uncertain and distant as she was. What do you want to talk about? I asked. Amrita sighed and looked aside. I cupped her chin and turned her face back to mine. Really? What do you want to talk about? Amrita took a deep breath. This is everything you've been working towards. This is what you've been fighting for. Isn't it? I nodded slowly. Probably. Amrita raised her eyebrow quizzically. Probably. Well, there could be all sorts of other things that I might have been working for, I said. Like the betterment of mankind, uplifting Westeros. All of that are noble goals. But side goals to your main focus, Amrita said flatly. This is what you meant about putting aside everything else, isn't it? I took another deep breath, my chest clenching. I managed to nod. Yeah. It is, I said. Amrita sucked in a breath. She then looked me right in the eyes. Then if you have to marry Daenerys, she stated. Now it was my eyebrows' turn to rise. Wait, what? Look, that's on the table but nothing. Princess Arianne can marry someone else and gain the same power and influence. No one else has dragons. No one else can help us save the world. She is a teenaged girl and you are one of the most famous men on this planet. So if you must do it. She adjusted her glasses. Don't think about me. Don't think about anything else. Just do it. I looked intently into her eyes, gritting my teeth. Amrita. I can't do it, Amrita ordered. If you don't do everything in your power to save the world, then any feelings I have for you are based on a lie. And I will not love a lie. She looked aside. Do you understand, Lord Greyjoy? I took a deep breath. I forced myself to nod. All right. I promise. Good, Amrita said softly. I'll handle things in your absence. I lifted her chin up. Smiled. A smile part of me was able to feel genuine, while the rest of me felt hurt. I know. I wouldn't trust anyone else, I said genuinely. Amrita nodded back, a slight blush coming to her cheeks. It's funny how your priorities change when you know the world might end, isn't it? I asked. Amrita smiled a bit back. It is, she agreed. She bit her lower lip. Before she stood up on her tiptoes and kissed my lips. Briefly, chastely, but it still sent a spark of electricity through my spine. I reached out to embrace her, but she pulled away. She turned away, and headed off, her head held high. I watched her go, and sighed. So. Get everything you wanted? I asked the empty air. Varys crept out from an alcove. The eunuch looked amused, and he nodded. Can any man truly be said to get everything he wants? Varys asked. I shrugged. Ask some other man, because I haven't, I admitted. I looked over at Varys. So. What now? Varys smiled. Now. We protect mankind. It makes this Game of Thrones seem very pedestrian, doesn't it? In the Game of Thrones, you either win or you die, I said. Varys cocked his head. Indeed. Who said that? I gave him a sickly smile. Spoilers, I said cheerfully. Also, if anything happens to Amrita, it won't. Suffice it to say, it is in all our best interests to allow such an incredible mind to remain on our side, Varys said. I nodded, feeling a bit foolish. Thanks. I turned and headed down the hallway. I had a ship to catch, a dragon princess to woo, and a world to save. Since when did I become a shonen manga hero? XCV, new page, part 2. AC 300, Yunkai, Dragon's Bay, Essos. The captain's cabin of Euron Greyjoy's warship was a dark, foreboding room, filled with the arcane plunder of a lifetime of sailing where man was not meant to travel. Shelves lined with trinkets and trophies, strange scents of alien spices and the glitter of bejeweled death masks of long-forgotten kings. The only illumination came from a tiny, open window cut in one wall, and a handful of scattered, glass-covered lanterns. A trilling sound drew Euron's attention to the window, but he just grinned as he saw a tiny seabird land on the ledge. Lifting a finger to his lips, he shushed the bird, then chuckled at his little joke. Silence is golden. Or would be, if I could afford the plating, he sighed. Can you imagine? A world where gold is plentiful enough to plate a ship. Such waste, such extravagance. It's a fucking miracle, that's what it is. Humans will always be humans, no matter how powerful they become. He turned to his guest, sitting in the chair across his desk. She was silent, bound in canvas and rope. One rope served as a gag across her thin, disapproving lips. Yet that's the kind of world I saw. One I liked. He looked the woman up and down, smirking deeply. He walked around the desk and drew his long dagger, letting it glint in the dim light. He slid his knife down, through the rope, and it broke quickly. The canvas hood slid off, revealing rivulets of blonde hair that tumbled down her back. Emerald green eyes glared at him, her thin lips pressed into a sneer. Euron reached back to the desk, and procured a bottle. He pulled the cork, and took a long draught of the blue liquid. He let it dribble down his lips, and grinned down at Cersei Lannister. So tell me, my lady. You just like being tied up? That a fucking thing with you. He took another swig, as the fugitive queen lifted her pointed chin in defiance. It's not like it could affect me in any real way. My god watches over me, she said in a low, even tone. Euron chuckled, and set his bottle down. He wiped his lips, and leaned forward. So he does. There's plenty who would watch over a hot fuck like you. So, tell me. Why the blonde bitch queen? Can't be for protection, the price on her head is just as high as yours. The blonde woman shrank. Her hair turned from gold to a deep, red copper color. Her skin became pale, her lips full and red. Her eyes large and warm, but no less dangerous. She shrugged demurely, placing her hands in her lap. Convenience, Melisandre said. She was convenient for the time, and people want her alive. And it got me an audience with you. She smiled. Well, I'm not gonna shoot you just yet. What do you want? Euron asked, genuinely curious. In my visions of flame, I saw 4 faces. One I do not recognize, Theon Greyjoy, Daenerys Targaryen. And you, Euron Greyjoy. I want to know why. She tilted her head like a curious cat. Euron scoffed, shaking his head. Why? You really think I'll just give it up like that? Euron's scoff turned into a laugh. Melisandre remained as unperturbed as ever. He wondered what it would take to rattle her. Of course not. But given we face a common foe, the sharing of certain information would be useful. After all, I came this far. Euron grumbled a bit. I hate a damn cunt with sense. He stalked around the desk to stare out the windows. The bird was still there. He ignored it as his gaze went out. Far beyond the sea, and the port. Far beyond the curvature of the world itself. Your visions in fire tell you about things, do they not? All sorts of random crap you try to fit into a proper picture. He asked in a soft, distant tone. Melisandre nodded. Not how I would put it, but you are an unbeliever. Euron turned around and slammed his bottle of blue onto the desk. It shattered, the pieces flying all over the deck. Melisandre didn't flinch, even as Euron loomed over the desk with a wide eye and gaping, panting jaw. Wrong. I believe. Because I have seen it, he bellowed. I have seen everything. I know. The shape of the world. I know. And I believe. Melisandre's stare never wavered. Seen. What? She asked, eyes glowing in interest. Euron stalked back around the table, looking down at his hands. He slowly looked up to her, his wild eye meeting hers. The future. The past. One and the same, Euron whispered harshly, a mad grin emerging on his face. I saw Ned Stark's head chopped off like I was there myself, to a baying crowd's delight. I saw the fall of the Wolf King to that toad's trickery, his head lopped off and his wolf's head sewn onto his shoulders instead. I saw his rose bitch marry little Tommen, and then be burnt away in a flash of wildfire. I saw the wall fall, to a dragon serving the Night's King. I saw it all. All of it. Melisandre sucked in a deep breath. But those things. Euron held up a hand. Haven't happened? No. But they did. Time was set in one way, a single session of hundreds of events, all seamlessly fitting together. Like a fucking song, formed by an orchestra. Then. He took a deep breath. It all changed. Like someone sent knowledge of it back, to another session. Changed the song. All through a single person. Melisandre stared, and licked her lips as a sudden thought hit her. But who? Daenerys Targaryen. Theon Greyjoy. My very own nephew. Euron announced, spreading his arms wide and laughing wildly. Of all the people, he was fucking chosen to get the knowledge of the session. And plenty more besides. He leaned forward, and grinned. If I'd gotten to him even a bit sooner, we could have had it all in our hands by now. It's not every uncle who can say his nephew rules most of the world. Euron shook his head, chuckling in satisfaction. So why all this? Melisandre asked. Because I couldn't get close to him, Euron said, shaking his head, not close enough. I had to bring him here. And through him, I can find the one who sent him back in time. And have him start it all over again. Melisandre stared at Euron, biting her lower lip. Why? She asked. So that I can be the one making the changes. Making the decisions. I could use a hot bitch like you on my side though. What do you say? Shape the world, as you wish, Euron said with a grin. Melisandre scowled. The Lord of Light the Red Priestess tried, but Euron invaded her personal space and took her hands. If everything falls to ice and death, his edicts don't fucking matter. Unless he planned for this. Unless he was ready to send you back to get it right. Don't you get it? He's handing you his power, the true power of God. And all you have to do is reach out, and take it. Euron grinned. Melisandre stared back at Euron, and began to laugh. She laughed softly, dangerously, the dim light glinting in her eyes. You would be a dangerous ally, Euron Greyjoy. Yet, Euron said, leaning in to touch his nose to hers. His voice dropped to a deadly whisper. But I'd be a worse enemy. I'm going to get that power. And you can help me, or I'll just deal with you next time. What will it be? If it aids the ASoIaF in his destiny, it will come to pass. If not, it will fail. For the moment, Euron Greyjoy. I am with you. Good, Euron grinned, stroking her chin. So. What happened to the blonde bitch queen, anyway? Melisandre shrugged. Still alive. I need her to remain so for the spell. Euron chuckled. Well. Maybe we can find a use for her, too. He threw another bottle at the window. The bird fluttered away, frightened. And Bran Stark was left blinking away sleep. He started, taking deep breaths as he looked around. Summer was still wrapped around him like a warm blanket. Hojan was on his right side, snoozing. Qyburn was on the other, and Hodder was behind them with his huge arms around them protectively. Bran looked up at the ceiling of the long-abandoned cabin, his heart pounding in his ears. He didn't know what to do. He didn't know how long he had left. All he knew was that he had to find the three-eyed raven. As soon as possible. For everyone's sake. Canon_the boom squid is born. Daenerys, so, Lord Theon, please tell me, how did you first demonstrate your brilliance to Lord Stark? Theon, well. In the past, Ned Stark is walking around Winterfell in some concern. Ned, Theon? Theon. He headed for an old guard tower that has smoke coming from it. He knocked on the door, and upon receiving no answer, opened the door and entered *. Ned, Theon, are you all right? The interior of the guard tower is now filled with bits of wood and metal, containers of every kind, books, instruments, and papers covered in drawings and writings Ned can barely fathom. He looks to a large wooden table covered in boxes, cans, and bags *. Theon, 8 years old, wearing an oversized helmet on his head, grinding something in a bowl. Starts. Oh. Lord Ned. He looked at a contraption Ned recognizes as some kind of clock. Oh. Dinner? Ned, yes. You've been making a habit out of being late, Theon. I have been tolerant since you did have that fit a few days ago, but I can't help being concerned. Theon, sorry. I had an idea. Well, a lot of ideas. So I kind of lose track of time. But I finished. Ned, examining a paper. What's this? General and Special Relativity. Theon, oh. That one is about how space itself is curved by mass and how it relates to the at Ned's confused look. He coughs. You know, it isn't important. Again, I am sorry about it. I just. Ned. Your father is not one for reading. I have heard people say that. Theon, nods. Yet. My uncle loved to read. I tried to go to his library whenever I could. But my father disapproved. Thought it made you weak. He grinned. But here there are so many books and ideas and. It's wonderful. In fact, I figured something out and I want you to be the first to see. Ned, that's good, Theon, but we should do it after dinner. Theon, please? I promise it won't take long. Ned, well. All right. What is it? A few minutes later at an old stump, Theon busily pours a black powder and a few other things into a pot, seals it tight, and lays a string from it all the way to a boulder Ned is sitting behind. The Lord of Winterfell is smiling in confusion. Ned, Theon? What? Theon, okay. Short version, everything has energy inside it. From the world to us. And we can access that energy in many ways, from eating food to power our bodies, to burning wood for heat. With me so far? Ned, yes. Theon, well, I figured out how to liberate a lot of energy, all at once, with chemistry. No magic required. He lights the string and the flame moves to the pot. He crouches down and covers his ears. Please cover your ears. Ned, does so, and ducks lower behind the boulder. Something in his instincts tells him to brace, but why? Kaboom! Ned winces, his ears ringing. He sat up and gasped. The stump was gone, just a blackened crater remaining. His hearing returns, just in time to hear Theon cheering. Theon, yes. Yes. It worked. Woo. I'm a genius. Woohoo. Ned watches Theon dance for joy, and slowly looks back at the crater. Thank the gods Balon didn't pay him any mind. There were many offers to Ned and Balon to marry Theon. Balon ignored them and Ned politely asked them to wait until a certain time. Now the floodgates are open. Before, it was simply a trickle. That and any marriage proposals made to Theon went over his head, as he was too focused on his work. Many years ago. Gior. Rise, rise. No need to stand on such ceremony out here. What brings you to the mainland? Ned asked the former ruler of Bear Island. Ned, his son Robb, Theon and several bodyguards were camped around a fire by the side of the road that led to Winterfell. They were returning from Deepwood Motte where they had overseen the construction of a college which Theon had described as a specialized kind of school for more advanced learning. Why it wasn't just called that instead of a college didn't make much sense to Ned, but he had long since stopped questioning most of Theon's more harmless quirks. Gior Mormont rose to his feet with a grin. Between my son taking over the island and my sister putting all that shipbuilding knowledge she learned from young Theon here, I find myself with a lot of free time and I can only spoil my nieces so much before my edge starts glaring at me. Figured I should do a bit traveling, see what else has changed in the north. The Manderleys have made a lot of progress with building ships of their own, Theon interjected. You should consider stopping by White Harbor to compare how they do it versus your own people. Gior grimaced at the mention of the Manderleys but hit it quick enough that Ned was pretty sure he was the only one to notice it. Ned knew there was some good-natured competition between Bear Island and White Harbor over who could build the best ships, but it shouldn't have been enough to provoke a reaction like that. He'd have to look into this. Actually, Lord Stark, while I got you here there is something I'd like to talk to you about in private when you have the time. It's nothing urgent though, so it can wait if need be. Well, if Gior was just going to hand him the perfect opportunity to ask about it. We can do it now, let's take a walk. As Ned's guards started to stand he waved them off. Stay, sit, we'll remain in eyesight. You can come running if you hear any shouting. Once they were far enough from the camp that he didn't worry about accidental, or intentional, eavesdropping, Ned turned to Gior and sternly asked, so what's really got you off the island? I saw how you reacted to the mention of the Manderleys. It would be very out of character of you to start a blood feud over some like shipbuilding. No. Gior interrupted before stopping and taking a breath to calm down. No, nothing like that, my lord. My apologies. I promise you that the motivation for my trip is altruistic in nature. Ned's face softened. My apologies as well for jumping to conclusions. So then, what does bring you here? I'm looking for marriage prospects for Daisy and Alysanne. Ned raised one eyebrow. You are? Not Maej or Yura. Gior shrugged. They've both got a lot to deal with at the moment and, as I said early, I have a lot of free time. I can't think of a better use for myself than traveling around and doing a thorough job of getting to know my potential good nephews. And what does that have to do with the Manderleys? Is it that they don't have any young men of the appropriate age? Gior rubbed the back of his neck and gave Ned an embarrassed look before speaking. No. That was because I'm aware Theon has been spending a fair amount of time in White Harbor recently and I thought he might be a good match for Daisy if Wyman hadn't already made you an offer yet. Ned fought to keep his face straight as he responded. Whaley did ask about arranging a betrothal between Theon and either of his daughters. Gior scowled but Ned continued. But I told him the same thing I'm going to tell you. While I've helped raise Theon and in many ways I view him as a son, he is my ward and not actually my own flesh and blood. So I won't promise him in marriage without consulting both him and his own father first. Gior's scowl only became more pronounced as he said, you really give a bear's fart what his father thinks. Not in matters of governance but when it comes to family he should, at the very least, be informed. So if all you want is to let the old squid know, why not set a betrothal up? Part of it is the same reason I haven't done so with any of my children. They're young, they have the rest of their lives to think about marriage. Let them enjoy being single and free. Okay, that's part of it. What's the other part? Ned sighed. It's Theon. He's a handful. While I don't doubt your nieces are very knowledgeable, capable women, I'm not entirely sure they, or any woman frankly, have what it takes to wrangle him into some semblance of a head of a noble house. Between myself, my wife, and Maester Lewin we're barely able to keep him from blowing himself up most days. If he were to go off to some keep that he was in charge of, where everyone had to listen to him. Gior appeared to think of this before shuddering. All right, I see your point. I'm not saying I won't ever arrange a match for him, but I want to wait a few years. Give him a chance to calm down, gain some life experience, learn some self-control, and some self-preservation hopefully. Sansa resisted the urge to roll her eyes as Alice continued to ask her questions about Theon. The Karstark girl thought she was being subtle, but it was painfully obvious she was trying to get information on how to charm Theon, which just made Sansa want to laugh. You'd have better luck trying to seduce hotter than you would Theon. Sansa would have thought Theon was a sword swallower given how little attention he seemed to pay to girls that flirted with him, but she never saw him do anything with any men either. Occasionally, Sansa had caught Theon staring at her, usually when she had bent over. She never called him on it because he'd always mutter and shake his head. And she still wasn't entirely sure why he would look at her. He had invented the brassiere after all. He might have been staring because he saw a problem that needed solving. Maybe next he'd invent a dress that didn't take half a candle to get into. A horn being blown interrupted Sansa's thoughts as well as whatever Alice had been saying. Lord Stark returns, shouted one of the men up on the battlements. That means Theon is coming back too, right? Alice asked. Unless Theon had to stay Deepwood Motte for some reason, Sansa answered. He's pretty knowledgeable after all. They might have needed his help with some problem. Alice frowned. Father said I should get to know him, if only so he can give me advice on how to keep my brothers in check. I would hate to have come on this trip for nothing. Sansa reappraised Alice out of the corner of her eye. That's the most straightforward thing you've said to me. Alice's cheeks reddened and she winced. I didn't mean, please don't. Sansa cut her off with a chop of her hand through the air. No, that's what you need to do. Dancing around what you mean and hoping Theon gets the message won't work. You need to be very direct with him, otherwise he won't get what you're trying to tell him. Direct, hey? I can be direct, Alice said as much to herself as to Sansa. Come on, we should get ready to receive father. As Sansa and the rest of her family assembled in the courtyard, she noticed Alice and Rickard Karstark standing off to the side. Rickard was glancing at his daughter with a funny expression on his face. It took Sansa a moment to figure out why. Alice had, somehow, gotten hold of some makeup. Of Theon's numerous inventions and quirks, one of the things Sansa had never expected him to involve himself in had been makeup, and yet, even there, he had made improvements. He had insisted they stop using metal in face powder and had even made it so that lipstick didn't smell terrible, both of which Alice had applied to herself. If she's the only one dressed up, it'll be awfully obvious what she's doing, Sansa thought to herself. But then, that's what I told her to do. As the group dismounted from their horses, Sansa saw father head straight to mother to give her a hug. It was quite sweet, how much they loved each other. That was the sort of marriage Sansa hoped to have when she had a regal knight for a husband. Alice marched up to Theon with the kind of determination you'd expect to see on soldiers heading into battle. Sansa could see Lord Karstark seemed torn between running after his daughter and not causing a scene in front of his liege lord. Oh, hello there, Theon started to say as he noticed Alice, but he quickly shut up as she grabbed the front of his shirt and pulled him into a long, though still chaste, kiss. Sansa couldn't decide whose face she wanted to watch more right now. Lord Karstark's expression kept switching between anger and shock. Mother looked scandalized while father looked like he was trying to keep himself from smiling. Robb was looking back and forth between Alice and Theon like he couldn't believe what he had just witnessed. Alice was panting and was waiting for a response from Theon, who was staring blankly at Alice. Theon blinked several times and cocked his head to the side and then rubbed his fingers across his lips. Alice's lipstick, which had smeared across Theon's lips, was now on his fingertips. He gave his fingers a lick and then grimaced. That stuff tastes terrible. And you put that on your lips? Alice nodded dumbly. Well, that won't do at all. Thank you for bringing this problem to my attention. Theon quickly spun on his heels and walked towards his tower. Sansa slowly approached Alice, who looked crestfallen. I'm sorry, she said, laying a hand gently on Alice's shoulder. He can be rather oblivious. But, I just... Don't take it personally, Robb said, apparently having stopped being stupefied by what just happened. You aren't the first girl Theon has ignored that expressed interest in him, though you are the first one who's been that blatant about it. But I kissed him, Alice shrieked. You told me to be direct. How much more direct could I be? So you're saying this breach of behavior wasn't your idea? Mother's voice sternly echoed behind Sansa. Oh. Oh, make, the King's Thunder. 298 AC, Winterfell, the North. King Robert Baratheon took a swig from his wineskin as he swung down from his horse, with the able assistance of several Baratheon armsmen. Gods, Ned, man was not meant to get up this early in the morning, my bed calls out to me, as does the 3 lovely lasses that still keep in warm, while you drag me all across your cold, wet land. Why so cold, Ned? You'd think you northerners would get tired of the same weather all the time. Hardly the same all the time, insisted Lord Eddard Stark, dismounting rather more gracefully than his liege, the advantage of being several stone lighter. Look at today's weather, the snow is on the ground, the wind chills from the wall, and it rained for an hour after sunrise. Why, it's practically summer. Sometimes, you know, it actually gets cold up here. Ha, fucking ha, Ned, grumbled the king, taking another drink before tossing the wineskin to a waiting servant. So what's so bloody important that you had to drag me all the way out here? He looked about at the grey stone cliffs about them. This was one of the quarries my ancestors used to cut the stones that formed Winterfell. These days, we've found another use for it. He waved the king over to where a group of workmen were fussing around an odd-looking contraption, a long cylinder of metal placed on large wagon wheels. Standing nearby was a young man in grey, overseeing the workers. Robert grunted. Greyjoy, eh? Ned, I know you've grown a bit attached to the lad, but need I remind you, he's a fucking Greyjoy. More, he's a hostage. If Balon ever decides to lose his mind again, it's your job to put that fancy sword of yours through his scrawny little neck. Ned sighed. Honestly, from what I've learned, Balon cares very little for the boy, yet he has proven time and again to be of great value to the north and the realm. Theon longs to be useful, and his mind is unique. Besides, I think you will like what he's created here. The king grunted again in a noncommittal tone, and let Ned lead him over to the boy. Theon, I hope your little demonstration is ready. Young Theon Greyjoy seemed to be a bundle of nervous energy, his eyes constantly darting from one point of interest to another, but paused when he looked at the king, and swept into a deep bow. Your Grace, thank you for coming. It had better be good, little squid, or I'll have the castle's cooks start preparing calamari. Theon laughed somewhat nervously but launched into his prepared speech. Right. So, today we have a demonstration of the newest model of gun produced by Winterfell's craftsmen. We had such great success with the 6-pound cannon that I went ahead and poured a 9-pound bronze barrel. Boy, I care little for barrels unless they contain wine, or women, or both, interrupted the king. And I've seen your thunderers, nice little toys, but hardly a replacement for a good hammer. But he paused and studied the large metal device. Although, I've never seen one of your guns that fucking big before. Absolutely, Your Grace, most of the weapons we've traded south have been of the handheld variety, and not exactly the most powerful or accurate versions. This, if you will, is the scorpion to the musket's crossbow. He pointed across the quarry and indicated where 3 stakes had been driven into the ground, one in front of the other, a heavy steel breastplate fastened to each. Here is our target, they represent a thickly packed block of infantry. Expensive fucking infantry, if they're all wearing plate like that, grumbled Robert. True, but I find it's best to test against the worst case scenario, imagine a group of dismounted reach knights, instead. I'm liking it better already, how about Dornishmen instead? Of course, Your Grace. So, these Dornish knights are advancing towards us, but fortunately, we have our new weapon loaded and ready. He paused, then glanced over his shoulder. I said, we have our new weapon loaded and ready. Lord Theon, loaded and ready. Cried one of the men, belatedly realizing that he had missed his cue. Sighing, Theon raised a hand and indicated a nearby structure, a heavy berm of earth, sandbags and wooden beams with a narrow viewing slit. If you would be so kind, Your Grace, my lord. What, you expect me to hide while you show off your new toy? Demanded the king, but Ned coughed. Robert, while his inventions are generally effective, they're not always successful the first time they're tried, and guns this big tend to, well, explode. Violently. Like a jar of wildfire combined with a shower of metal shards flying faster than arrows. You can do what you like, but I'm going behind the blast shield. Robert looked over where Theon was attaching a long string to the rear of the gun, and shrugged, following his best friend. This had better be worth the trouble, he stated, as Theon started to shout. This is the 9-pound smoothbore cannon, firing at stationary targets, test number 1. In 3, 2, 1, fire. He screamed, yanking on the rope, and Robert cried out in surprise as he felt the cracked thum of the explosion pass through his chest, rattling his teeth and driving the breath from his lungs. The smoke and fire drew images of long-dead dragons to mind, and immediately he knew why Theon insisted on calling his weapons guns. By the crone's wrinkled teats, he breathed, as the smoke started to clear, and all 3 of the targets were gone. Not battered, not knocked about, destroyed. Workers ran out to pick up the ruined breastplates from the wreckage, and Robert was stunned to see that each had neat holes as big as his fist. Well, Ned's fist, right through the middle. Of course, this is a single cannon, shooting at stationary targets, noted Theon, pulling a piece of rag cloth from his ear, but I think it shows the potential. Imagine a dozen of these guns, firing once every 2 minutes, or faster, into packed enemy formations. Imagine, instead, a scythe tearing through wheat. He smiled. An old Geese writer said that infantry was the queen of battle. Well, cannon is the king, and we all know what the king does to the queen, right? He asked cheekily. Boy, I know what you're meaning, but it doesn't happen all that often. But then he grinned. But I love it. A dozen, you say? No, instead, imagine a score of them. I don't care how much it costs, but I want ranks of your bronze dragons to make my armies invincible in battle. Ha! Theon cleared his throat. If you please, your grace, we also have a demonstration of what happens when our cannons strike at stone walls. The effect is quite impressive. Robert grinned. They work against walls, too? By the gods, boy, I'm starting to see why Ned likes you so much. 7 hells, I might just adopt you myself. Gods know that little blonde twit isn't much good for an heir. He snorted. Hard to believe he's mine, come to think of it. Anyway, got anything else that throws thunder about? Boy. Robert paused, and slapped the choking Theon on the back. Come on, lad, better out than in. What's got into you? Someone bring this quid a drink. Bringing the pikes down. His father had been a simple captain in a trading ship, whose home was in Bear Island, who had to risk his life pretty much every month in travels north and south along Westeros' western coast, avoiding pirates, ironborn reavers and other lowlives of the seas. He had died in one of those travels, to ironborn reavers just as Balon Greyjoy started his first rebellion, leaving his mother a widow and him as the eldest of 3 siblings that were now orphans. He had followed his father's steps, and joined the North's merchant navy, and had been witness to all the changes Theon Greyjoy, the only good thing to ever come out of those gods-be-damned Iron Islands, had introduced to his profession. And, when the War of the 5 Kings started, he had joined the Northern Navy, ready to pummel the Lannisters and the idiots that followed Balon Greyjoy into a second rebellion. And here he was now. He was Lord Rickard Stormbear, one of the most important and powerful men in the Northern Navy, and high enough in the structure of power that he had been handpicked to be the second in command on board of the HNMS Old Bear, the most powerful ship in the Sunset Sea, which was now sailing south and west as the sun rose from the coast. At points, he wished he was the captain of this beautiful, wonderful ship, but she who had been granted that honor was a magnificent choice, and if asked, he would feel no shame and all pride when claiming who he served under. A good morning to you, Lord Stormbear, Lady Lyanna Mormont, captain of the HNMS Old Bear, said as she joined him on the prow of the ship, where the seawater spray gave the air a wonderful smell. He touched the brim of his hat in deference to the girl who was closer to her 11th than her 10th name day, that was his immediate superior. A good morn to you as well, Lady Captain, he replied. I trust that you had a good night's sleep. I did. Now, please, tell me how the preparations for our mission are. Fairly well, Lady Captain. Every sailor understands their role very well. Lord Glover's soldiers know the stakes are high. The Mechman and Gearwives are finishing their revision of our artillery, and those in charge of logistics are ensuring our supplies are in a good place. We may not have as many soldiers as we would like, or as it would be usual, but they are all quite optimistic about our chances. Whatever the Ironborn have should not be able to stop our attack. Perhaps the men ought to remember that, right now, we do not have the numbers to carry out large operations like those they faced against the Lannisters, Lady Lyanna said, touching on one of the points that had been stressed well enough in the last days. And also that underestimating the enemy causes all sort of problems. The Lannisters underestimated us, the Ironborn underestimated us, look where both are right now. Rickard nodded, acknowledging the point. When the war began, the Lannisters had believed thunder arms were nothing but toys, the Ironborn had thought they were the be-all and end-all in the seas. In the end, the North had proven them wrong, the former had fallen to revolver, rifle, and cannon, and the latter's ships now adorned the depths of the Sunset Sea. Still, they are all hopeful that we will be able to put an end to the Ironborn. That was the dream every person from Bear Island had had, from babes just born to those a step away from the tomb, an end for the ancient enemy, the one the Starks had saved them from. And the irony of it, was that the one that was making it possible was an Ironborn, even if by birth, everyone agreed that Theon Greyjoy was as northern as a Stark. And there's also the news about the wall, and what's beyond it. The sooner we put an end to this last rebellion, the sooner we will be able to go north and help. The captain nodded, her gaze fixated on the horizon, maybe thinking about her great-uncle, gone missing in the great ranging that had brought the news about the White Walkers when Jonas, the ship's maester not actually from the Citadel, but given his job, the name had come to them, carrying a piece of paper. Lady Captain, Lord Stormbear, we have just received a raven from the Hungry Wolf. Finally, Lady Lyanna murmured, taking the paper and beginning to read it. The HNMS Hungry Wolf was the newest ship to come out of Bear Island's dockyards, of the same design that had created the Old Bear, and captained by Lady Alice Anne Mormont. Appears she, along with her escorts, passed Sea Dragon Point several hours ago. They ought to be in our sights soon enough. That will be a lot of firepower in our hands, he pointed out. Perhaps, even enough to destroy the entire Iron Fleet, the one they had before they made the mistake of fighting us. Best not to assume anything, however, the lady captain replied. We do know that they have probably taken some goat guns from what few merchantmen they were able to overwhelm, and if our spies are right, Euron Greyjoy somehow managed to convince a Brave Sea Forge to build him a few copies of our basic burners. Certainly not enough to stop our attack, but quite probably enough to cause us problems when the time comes for us to assault Pike. 'Tis a pity we have no ship capable of tendering balloons, Jonas said. We could drop anchor a few miles away from the coast, send a balloon up and have the men determine what fortifications and cannons the Ironborn have managed to place. Capital idea, Jonas. Take that note down, and when we are done with this fight send it. Perhaps Theon Greyjoy, or maybe the Karstarks, will be able to make your idea feasible. Before any of them could continue their conversation, from port began to ring a bell, catching their attention and their eyes. They soon fixated their sight on the ship nearest to them, the Bolt, one of the Old Bear's escorts whose lookout had managed to sight something, and the flags carried the message now. A small fleet of Ironborn raiders, numbering about 20, coming from the south. Probably an attack on the Reach. It matters not. General Quarters, Lord Stormbear. I want those ships captured, and a few Ironborn captains along with them if they have any useful information. I want to know it before we attack Pike. Ricard nodded, and turned his eyes to the rest of the crew. Stop lollygagging, you third-rate slackers. I want this ship ready for combat yesterday. Snow, sound General Quarters. General Quarters. The sailor shouted through his siren, and soon everyone was moving around, preparing the artillery and the thunder arms for the incoming fight. Lia. Alysanne Mormont, second daughter of Lady Maege Mormont, said as she approached her youngest sister and hugged her, a hug the girl returned with a rare smile gracing her features. Ollie. She replied, leaning into her, and Alysanne kissed her brow after they broke their hug. How are Maege and Gior? It's been quite a while since I last saw them. Quite fine, thank you very much. They are safely ensconced in my cabin at the ship, and would really like to see their aunt. You brought them here, to the front line? Lina asked, more curious than affronted. Alysanne snorted. Please, they would be in more danger at home, where I can't make sure to keep an eye on them. Maege is but a name day or two younger than you are, and I could barely leave poor Gior on his own. Plus, this way, they will start to get used to live on a ship. Mother may actually be planning to start Maege on the path of learning how to lead a ship, and Gior is starting to learn how to fight. Thank the gods, the Ironborn would have a hard time trying to get in the Hungry Wolf, unless they were prisoners. That's how much I trust the Theon, Alysanne said, chuckling. At Lina's raised eyebrow, Alysanne smirked. That's how everyone here has taken to unofficially call the ship. After all, it is named after Theon Stark. And other certain Theons. Lina sighed. She had heard Alysanne say she would have liked to grab Theon Greyjoy and ensure he gave her a third child in the House of the Bears. Children learned what went on in their elders' chambers quite sooner than usual, but, right now, she could not see the appeal. Well, let's get with the matter that concerns us. Yesterday, I found an Ironborn raiding party that surrendered as soon as they caught sight of the Old Bear. They thought iron ships were just tales by cowards running from the fight, and they, as well as the thralls we have liberated, have been quite talkative about recent events. For example, we now know that Euron Greyjoy has taken 2/3 of the Iron Fleet away to the east. They claim he is gone to make Daenerys Targaryen marry him along with the best cannons he could claim. Also, we have confirmed that some hapless Brave Sea supplied him some cannons, and between those, the goat guns they have taken and their own crude copies, Greyjoy thought it would be enough to protect Pike from us. Alysanne cracked up laughing, holding on to the nearest table for support. Seriously? He is as crazy as people claim. Those things are toys compared to our Mark IV burners. Never mind, they must be unreliable as shit. Lina rewarded her sister with another smile, before making her point. Indeed. The description of those cannons make my mechman think they should not be able to resist shooting for long without blowing up. Though, I do not intend to put that to test, so I guess we ought to deal with this in the safest way possible for us. Don't you think? Of course, of course. Well, what does your fine mind, and that of your men, have come up with to put an end to these iron idiots, little sister? Let's say I am of a mind to do it the easy way. The sun was rising over Lordsport, Pike's main port, and people followed by leaving their homes and preparing themselves to do what jobs they had. Some fixed up their homes, others readied their ships to go out there to fish, and a few manned the watchtowers that kept vigilance on the seas, either for the return of their king or to warn the rest of the island in case the Greenlanders decided to attack them. The air around the island was heavy and humid, mist covering everything on sight, making it impossible to see beyond 50 yards. But, if there was something that permeated the air in Pike and the rest of the Iron Islands, it was despondency. "Reckon Dagmar ought to have come back already, don't you think?" one of the men on one of the watchtowers said, while polishing, as best as he could, the gun he was in charge of. "Prawley got busy with taking salt wives and thralls from those weaklings in the Reach," one of his fellows replied, although, by the tone of his voice, it was obvious he did not hold much hope of that happening. "Prawley got sunk, you mean? Don't say that, Reg. You'll see, any time soon, they'll be there, and we can take our pick of the salt wives. If there's any left for we can, they'll be ugly and old. If she can give you salt sons, who cares about the face?" In another tower, the situation was slightly more lively. "Get down from there, ya idiot," the old reaver too old to go on a reeve now told the 8 and 10 boy that had decided to ride the gun like a horse. "Or else I'll think why are compensatin' for something. Pretty words, old man. Who do you learn 'em from?" "One of 'em Greenlander buggerers. Me mother, why ours?" The old reaver decided to cut to the chase and slapped the youngster on the back of the head, immediately making him fall from the gun. "Best learn to keep your mouth shut, if ya wanna live." The boy stood up and glared at the old man, sulking as he sat on one of the stools. "Man, can't wait till King Euron comes back with that dragon girl. We'll sure get to kick them Greenlanders and take what is ours. Don't count your ships afore gettin' out of th storm, boy. We don't know when he's gettin' back, and we don't know if them Greenlanders will see me afore he does. We've got guns, old man. If they come, they'll get blown, and when they run away, our longships will take 'em. Where do you think the king got 'em guns from? Them coward Greenlanders and th fucking boom squid made 'em, we took 'em by th iron price. They're bound to have more of 'em. Bah! They're cowards. They come here, they'll die." Boom! The men in every watchtower cringed as they heard the explosion, and it was soon followed by the screams of the people of Lordsport as they ran to take cover, and the sound of a falling tower mixed with that of the men that had been within. "By the drowned god!" the older man said, already wishing he was somewhere else. "Those fucking Greenlanders!" the boy screamed, pointing to the sea. "They're using the mist to cover themselves." The bells rang, and men started to run to the port, so they could board their longships and take them out to sea to defend their island, but as they did another explosion rang, and a second watchtower fell. "Load those guns, you fucking bastards! Fire at 'em! Fire!" Someone shouted, loud enough to be heard in several of the watchtowers, and those who had yet to run away began the arduous process of loading the guns. It was a difficult task, for they had barely had the chance to practice. Gunpowder was very scarce round these parts, but as the ships began to reach the open sea, they managed to push the balls in, some in iron, most in stone, and lit the guns. 2 of the cannons burst in pieces, unable to stand the pressure of the explosion, and left their crews dead or dying. As for the others, none of the balls managed to cover half the distance between themselves and the attacking ships. On board of the ships, other discussions were taking place. "It's only one ship. We send enough ships there, we can take it and use it against 'em," one said, trying to maintain the balance as they led their ship in the direction of the explosion. "Do you think the Greenlanders would send just one ship on its own to attack us?" Others replied, wanting to keep their ships away from the enemy. In those ships that were rowed by thralls, the mood was suitably better. "The north is here." Some of them whispered, being northerners themselves, they knew how cannons sounded, and those cannons were clearly the ones used by their navy. "We are safe." "How?" "They do not know we are here," others replied, fearful of both the Ironborn who had taken them from their homes and of dying because a northern ship chose to sink the longship they were being forced to row. "Then, we take the Ironborn down and take the ship for ourselves." In those ships that carried cannons, the men were bloodthirsty, their eagerness to finally strike at their hated enemy with their own weapons visible to all, so much that it could be even smelled in the air. But their joy was to be short-lived. In the thrall's bane, one of the thralls, a former northerner sailor that had been biding his time until he could get back at those squids that had captured him and his friends, took the chance when the one closest to him turned his back on him, maybe fully confident that he would not dare to do anything. Then, the sailor jumped and grabbed him from behind. "Got you, you fucking asshole," the sailor growled in the Ironborn's ear, before beginning to crush his throat with one of his hands. The Ironborn tried to grab his sword, but another thrall took it and stabbed him through his heart, killing him in an instant. Blood left the Ironborn's body as he fell to the ground, the metallic smell spreading to the nose of every other man around, and the men that had been forced to work for the men that had captured them sprang into action. The group took advantage of the shock this caused on the Ironborn to attack them. In a different situation, it would have ended up in their deaths. Some died, unfortunately, but the recent events had caused the number of reavers per ship to drop. "The ship is ours." The former thralls shouted after killing the last Ironborn standing, and one of them climbed up the mast to take out the black flag with the yellow squid. The flag fell to the deck, and another decided to make his feelings known by pissing on it, to the cheers of every other man in the ship. Well, will you look at that? Lady Alysanne Mormont told her aide, Lady Lyra Flint, and her second, Lord John Frost. Those 4 ships have broken off the main group and stricken their banners. Strange. That ain't the Ironborn way. Normally, they do not surrender until they see they are going to be fucked like bitches if they don't, Lyra replied with a smirk. We can worry about that later. The problem now is the score of ships that are coming our way, Lord Frost indicated. Signal the bull to halt their attack and return to us. We should be able to cross the Ironborn's T when they get close enough. Soon, the bull, the ship that had been firing at the port with quite the high grade of accuracy, raised anchors and began to turn around to attract the attention of the incoming Ironborn ships and bring them to the trap laid beyond the horizon. The rising sun would make it hard for them to notice the ships until they were too close for it to matter, and placing the wooden ships in front before allowing the northern ships were already prepared for the fight, and it was but a matter of waiting. When do you figure the Ironborn will realize what's really going on? Lyra asked. If we are lucky, when it is too late for them to go back. Not knowing how 4 of their brethren ships had been taken over by the thralls that had been rowing them, the Iron Fleet or what remained of it, after all the mishaps it had suffered in the last year and a half, sailed out to meet that upstart northern ship that had dared attack them in their own homes. The wind was in their favor as they persecuted the retreating Greenlander ship, but the distance made it impossible to reach it with their chase cannons, but it would not matter, for the longships were faster than the Greenlander's ship. Soon, they would be able to. Ships on sight. A sailor in the crow's nest of the kite cried out, looking upon the horizon. What is it, Reem? The ship's captain shouted, as the other sailors prepared for battle. Greenlanders. Northern ships. The lookout replied, starting to enter in panic. Immediately, that same sort of panic spreaded to the men below him, never mind how much bluster they projected, every and each of them knew that any kind of fight with a northern warship would end in the death or destruction of whatever hapless Ironborn had decided to pick a fight with them. How many? The captain asked. Maybe, just maybe, the drowned god would feel kind this time, and allow them a fighting chance. Unfortunately for the captain, the sailor was not so good with his numbers, and with the battle nerves starting to show up in him, the sudden discovery he had just made and the much different case of nerve he suddenly had, there was only one thing he could say. All of them. Quite the exaggeration, of course, the northern ships were but a fraction of what the Northern Royal Navy could deploy at its finest. But the ships that fate or the storm god, perhaps had placed on their way were more than enough to pummel down the sad, pitiful remains of what had once been a powerful force. It was too late, however. Inertia, that property of objects where they keep a certain path unless enough force is applied to change it, pushed them forward, towards the enemy. And, as the horizon approached, they could see the ship they had been going after rushing to meet the large wooden boats, A&D. What the fuck? The lookout said, rubbing his eyes, thinking they were betraying him. They were not. For, in front of him of his ship, of the Iron Fleet stood 2 large ships, larger than any he had ever seen, both shining under the rising sun. Shining like the steel of the sword, the gold of the dragon. Iron ships. Iron ships. Iron ships. A few of them still believed that they were but a myth, made up by survivors to hide their cowardice, or their inability to live by the iron price. Now, before them stood the proof that it was no myth. It was nightmare. Before they could turn around, the cannons on board of every Greenlander ship exploded, and soon thereafter the Ironborn were divided between those lucky enough to die fast, those lucky to be able to jump off their ships and grab anything that floated, and those who were injured and unable to get out of the ships before they sunk. For them all, though, it was the end of everything they had lived with. And so dies the Iron Dream, Lord Stormbear said as the last remains of the Iron Fleet sunk. Detail ships to rescue the survivors. The other ships must advance. I want every cannon in there destroyed, Lady Lyanna replied. The watchtowers were rapidly abandoned by panicking Ironborn, who warned, shouted, screamed in panic about the now approaching Northerners. How the Iron Fleet had been sunk before they could even make a dent on the enemy. They had lost. The answer differed. Mothers hid in their homes with their children and babes, many with a knife in hand as a last resort defense. Young men and women either hid or brought whatever weapons they could find to fight the invaders when they came. The drowned men, as one, prepared for a fight. And then the daggers arrived to Lord Sport. Tell hot knife, greatsword and axe to look in all the ships that are still in port, Lady Alysanne said. If there's thralls in them, free them. If there is anything of value in them, take it. And then, hot knife is weapons free. Lord Frost replied, and turned to give the appropriate orders, wanting to watch the HMS Hot Knife's special weapon. Many months before, Tyrion Lannister had come up with a plan that had wrecked Stannis Baratheon's fleet, using wildfire to destroy and burn them with no hope of saving them. The Mormonts did not have access to wildfire, not that they would be interested in its use, given how volatile it was, and also because of its association with the Mad King, but had taken a page out of that book and, with the collaboration of the Bolton Mechman, had created the Hot Knife, a ship that was essentially a dagger but with a special addition, the existence of a salamander that could fire as a chase weapon. They knew it was a somewhat situational weapon, as the range was too short in comparison with that of cannons, but when about 90% of the other navies were still reliant on boarding and ramming other ships, the Hot Knife, which also had several cannons for long-distance attacks, was perfect for the act of making the enemy ship a living hell for its sailors. Soon enough, the Hot Knife was prowling in Lord Sport's dock. None of the ships contained rowers of any kind, whether thralls or freemen, but all of them contained maps, and one or two even small hidden treasures that were taken to the Hot Knife or its partners in this special attack. Two small doors on the front of the ships opened, and out came two wolves' heads, made of steel and with silver touches, their eyes red like rubies, and their mouths full of blue, red, and yellow and every color in between. And then, Hot Knife opened fire, pun completely intended. The first ship they met, the Tentacle, burned quite easily, and it broke down and sunk less than a minute after the salamanders started to spit burning north fire at it. All other ships within the port soon suffered the same fate, and as they did, the stink of the mixture of north fire, salt water and wood started to spread around Lord Sport. "Smells like defeat," one of the Ironborn said, realizing what had happened. "What can we do now?" Another asked, worried. "Nothing. There's nothing we can do. We're done for." Sergeant Torin gazed upon the scene in front of him, and glared at the pier as if it had greatly insulted his honor. Perhaps it had, in some way or another. Either way, he glared at it, and at the Ironborn that had believed they would be able to prevent him and his breachers first in and last out, all of them fine riflemen and not shabby at all when it came down to bayonets and a charge from putting a foot on the pier. Those Ironborn had rapidly learned that they had made a grave mistake, courtesy of the bolters on the HMS Greatsword's deck, although much to their misfortune, it was the last lesson they would be able to receive, as proved by the blood that now covered a good part of the pier. Casting his eyes away, he looked at his men and women, all of them with their weapons ready, packs to their backs and grim eyes. "You know the orders, people. If they don't fight, leave them alone. If they fight, then we shoot back," Sergeant Torin told them, and they all nodded as the plank was finally lowered, thus allowing them passage onto land. As they walked across the town, they noted many things. First of all, that Lord Sport was not all that different from the many coastal towns they had been to. The pervading smell of fish, whether fresh or rotten, was everywhere. Fishing nets abandoned to the wind and the elements appeared in this street or the other. The buildings were not too big, and with few windows, if it were not for the large castle on the distance and the threadbare black banners with yellow crocans that hung from several places, any of them could have sworn they were in the north. The second was the absolute lack of anything of green color. The Iron Islands were famous for their diminished surface of arable land and the lack of anything that deserved to be called forest, but one thing was to know about it and another to see it. Many would wonder how in the Seven Hells they actually managed to have a standing fleet at all, when they had not enough wood to even repair what they had. The third, it was less that they noted it than that it noted them. "What is dead?" The breachers turned immediately towards the source of the shout and, upon seeing 6 men running towards them with threatening attitude, chose to shoot before they could get any closer. "Rest in pieces." Hilda, one of the best shooters in the group, shouted at the now dead and dying drowned men, for that was what they were, at least if going by the fact they wore robes and had algae on their hair and carried large wooden cudgels with them. And the others turned to look at her. "What? I heard someone say it at Oxcross. I thought it felt appropriate." The group laughed aloud, and the sergeant smirked. "Whatever is dead, it lies dead," another soldier shared, drawing another chuckle from his partners. "Very well, people. Less talk, more moving. Sooner we secure this, sooner we get out of here. To the Castellan of Pike Castle. In first place, should you gaze from any of the towers in that castle of yours out to the sea, you will notice that our ships are now close enough to be seen at plain sight. You may believe yourself to be safe, but my guns have enough of a reach to strike it with each and every cannonball in our arsenal and make what happened to the Red Keep a footnote. In second place, you may have also noticed that the banners for Houses Stark, Mormont and several others from across the north have been risen in place of those of House Greyjoy. You may actually need a Myrish glass for that, but the summary is, Lord Sport is ours, and soon so will be every town and port in this island. In third place, you might have also noticed that each and every watchtower your so-called king built to protect Lord Sport has been destroyed, and also we have taken all the cannons that were stolen from our merchantmen. We have also freed every thrall that lived in Lord Sport and put an end to any kind of resistance that may have existed, particularly that of Aaron Greyjoy's most fanatic followers, and this without suffering any casualties. In order to put an end to this struggle, here is our first and only offer. You have until the next dawn to open your gates, surrender your weapons, return any captive you may still have, surrender the castle and island of Pike to us, and send messages to every other Iron Island to follow your example. Should you decide to reject these terms, we will take said surrender tomorrow from the rebel that may remain from our bombardment. These terms are not negotiable. No amount of begging, threatening or cajoling will make us change our terms. Any attempt at blackmailing us with the lives of our countrymen will only be answered with suffering on your part. Choose wisely, or choose death. Signed. Lady Lyanna Mormont, Captain of the HNMS Old Bear and Commander of the 2nd Northern Sunset Fleet. Omake, Semi-Cannon. On the way to the Mother of Dragons. The diplomatic mission towards Essos was a groundbreaking one in the history of Westeros for several reasons. First, there was the speed of which it was formed. Right after the decision for the three of them to go, in less time he thought possible, Tyrion the Halfman, Theon the Genius and Oberyn the Red Viper, were sailing towards Essos and leaving quite an impressive wake with the most eclectic fleet in the history of Westeros. Old wooden galleys, northern ironclads, steamships and multi-hulled oddities, fat-bellied brigs and sleek summer isle darters. Fishing boats sailed with warships and cargo freighters followed assault craft. The might and hodgepodge nature of the Seven Kingdoms in fleet form. Tyrion suspected Theon had planned for this, and many other possibilities well in advance. Cases of Tyrion's favored wines and appropriately sized furniture being already on board his room confirmed it. Second, the fortuitous timing of persons being sent. They were just about to walk on board their ship when Varys stopped them at the pier and quickly took them aside for urgent news. Apparently, Sansa, Cersei and Myrcella were in Daenerys Targaryen's court. Courtesy of Euron Greyjoy. A man with a reputation as a reaver so vile it made Balon Greyjoy look like a septon in comparison. While Tyrion didn't like the fact that the duty to rescue Cersei of all people fell to him, Jaime would have leapt to volunteer but Tyrion had sent him on an urgent mission elsewhere. Theon liked his adoptive sister, and Oberyn liked his good niece much more than Tyrion disliked Cersei. So if only because Jaime would never forgive him otherwise, Tyrion resolved to do his utmost in rescuing that stupid, arrogant, ungrateful bitch. Third, the ship they were sailing on was taking the lead by breaking all known speed records. Against the wind. With furled sails. Apparently the high breed only looked like a sloop, but beneath the deck it was crammed with Theon's latest creations. Networks of pipes, wires, stores full of coal, large barrels of oil and machinery that was propelling them through some mechanism beneath the water. What little space in the hold that wasn't taken up by Theon's wonders were dedicated to carrots and sticks. Theon's amusing euphemisms for threats and bribes, the two most essential tools of diplomacy. As for what to do when they actually reached their destination though, Theon gave a less than reassuring reply. "We'll wing it." An expression that Tyrion concluded meant jumping off a great height and then flapping your arms wildly in hopes of learning to fly before hitting the ground. And the scary thing is, Tyrion couldn't say for sure that Theon would be unable to invent something to allow flight before hitting the ground. Still, for the sake of prudence Tyrion was formulating his own plan. Cryptic notes and dusty tomes covered his desk. Everything from the Spider's reports about the character and temperament of Daenerys Targaryen to Maester's records about her lineage and their histories were being reviewed for precious hints on how to best approach her. Obviously blessed by the gods considering her luck, and while not mad or excessively cruel given the rather low bar set by her family, she was still quite vicious against those she deemed her enemies as the Free Cities was learning as she cut a bloody path through them. Hours later, Tyrion was no closer to an answer to the fundamental problem. What did she want? If it was the Iron Throne, then even her vaunted luck was no use. The Iron Throne was no more. Kept only as a reminder and a mockery of days past that none of the Seven Kingdoms would wish a return to. If she pressed the issue with dragons, then the Boomskid's guns would turn them into mincemeat. But she had hostages. Including the Boomskid's adopted sister. And while they had the strength to threaten a naval bombardment on any coastal city that would leave no stone atop another, there really was much more pressing matters to attend to and more important things to do with gunpowder since the dead were marching down to kill everyone. With the avenue of threats closed, Tyrion wondered what sort of enticement would be suitable for this situation. Obviously the old standby of wealth and power would be effectively worthless. If the wealth of several city-states, an army of Unsullied and the Dothraki were not enough to satisfy Daenerys Targaryen, then there was nothing they had that would. Finding himself no closer to a workable angle, Tyrion decided to take a break and step out for a walk about the deck where he saw an unusually pensive-looking Prince Oberyn. "I need your help," was all Oberyn said when he approached. Tyrion quirked a brow curiously. It was always good to have fellow nobles owe you favors of course, but for the life of him, Tyrion couldn't think of anything Oberyn would need his help with. "It's about Theon." "Oh right. Him. This mission is heading straight towards disaster. And it may still be a disaster of epic proportions unless, no, even, if we work together." Tyrion blinked, and regarded Oberyn carefully. While Tyrion knew Prince Oberyn had a flair for the dramatic, the gravity of Oberyn's words seemed sincere. It was quite out of place on the normally flippant and supremely confident prince. "Whatever do you mean?" Tyrion asked. "Just look at him." Oberyn pointed towards Theon, who was apparently done inspecting the workings of the ship and was now hauling another bucket up from the railing onto the deck. Tyrion had asked about that earlier. What he understood from Theon's bewildering reply was that properly mapping the ocean currents and making notes on water temperature was going to help predict the weather. Meanwhile, two rather buxom young sailors, who were wearing fetchingly tight and strategically torn clothes, were sauntering about the deck. Swabbing in a manner so suggestive, Tyrion felt compelled to toss a few coins at the performance. Alas, Theon was too distracted by a bucket of salt water to even notice. Finally though, he peeked his head up and requested another bucket, then returned to cataloguing the seaweed samples. Two sailing wenches walk off with shattered egos. I see what you mean, Tywin said with a grimace. Theon's way with women was actually painful to watch. It was as if he spent every waking moment from his boyish youth on to full manhood, studying and mastering every conceivable subject matter except women. He isn't a sword swallower. Because otherwise he would not have refused when I offered to join him in bed, Oberyn said matter-of-factly. And Arianne said he was quite enthusiastic when she and Amanda finally dragged him off to bed, so I'm sure his parts are still there and in working order. But we can't just rely on his boyish good looks to win the day. He's going to have to go against Euron Greyjoy soon. And while I have never met the man, I'm willing to bet a fortune that the pirate captain knows more about how to charm a woman than our young genius. So it falls to us to make that. Oberyn pointed at Theon, who was apparently now tasting seaweed before bottling samples and making notes about them, into something that can charm a Targaryen. Or at the very least, not anger her so much she sets her dragons on us. Tyrion nodded. This was going to be a challenge. But the gods were kind. Because of all the womanizing knaves in Westeros, no pair was better suited to helping fools or geniuses get good with women than Tyrion and Oberyn. I apologize for this crackfic, but the muse snuck up on me with her good friend Insomnia. Oh make? Alright Theon, once more from the top. Tyrion put needle to disc and one of Theon's marvels started to make music. A courtly and timeless waltz that was suitable for formal occasions yet easy enough to allow discussion. Darling Theon, my wonderful genius. You are the man of my dreams. Marry me, and together, we can rule the world. Oberyn said in a truly horrifically bad falsetto while making cow eyes at Theon, dragging the hapless Greyjoy across the deck in a masterful show of grace and dancing mastery. Lady, I'm smart enough to know that is a bad idea. The paperwork alone would kill us both. Theon followed along with a grimace. He was actually passable, but despite being younger and theoretically doing easier steps, couldn't quite get his face and tone into the practice. Partly because the tight pants his two fellow diplomats stuffed him into were starting to chafe. But mostly due to the fact that Oberyn was in front of him wearing a really poofy, low-cut dress with a high slit showing off a lot of hairy leg. A white wig on. The man had not stopped with the flirting either. It was either that or, you dare refuse me. Your sister shall burn. Your kingdoms shall burn. Everything you love will burn because you rejected my tender, feminine feelings, and not once did you try to grab my ass. Oberyn angrily shoved Theon nearly off Theon's feet, turned his back but then wiggled his butt most dramatically. How about, nope. Dragons may have unbeatable 20 years ago, but you try anything and we'll be eating dragon jerky through the winter. Theon rolled his eyes and kept his hands firmly by his sides, away from Oberyn's ass. Which was probably why the slap caught him totally unprepared. You beast! How could you threaten my family like that? You heartless monster! I will burn your family for this. Oberyn then proceeded to fake cry in his hands, peek every few seconds, then resume crying. Oh, for crying out loud! I quit. This is ridiculous. Theon snapped. He stomped over to where the record player was and took the needle off. Well, good news is, this time you lasted a good 5 seconds longer than usual. Care to guess what you did wrong? Tyrion asked casually as he sipped some Monkey Island grog. A cocktail of Theon's make that was actually quite refreshing and cured the sailor's wilt. Bit harsh. Strong hint of limes. My guess would be agreeing to this farce. Dany isn't Cersei, Tyrion. Popping out of the dancing clogs unleashed a hiss of pure bliss. No, she's not. By all accounts, she'll be much worse. Tyrion said seriously. Theon massaged his feet while he gave Tyrion a curious look. Tyrion, I am sorry to say this, but I doubt there is any woman who is a bigger bitch than Cersei Lannister. Ha! On that I wholeheartedly agree, me friend. I agree indeed. Tyrion downed the rest of his grog and prepared to give Theon the summary of intelligence notes their vaunted spy master could supply. By all accounts she is kind-hearted, a survivor, and either blessed by the gods or extremely capable to go from a babe on the run to a ruler of cities, master of armies and in control of 3 dragons. And apparently, she has quite a distaste for slavers, declaring them her enemy and showing them no mercy. If she decides we are her enemy, she will not rest until we are destroyed, and unlike my sister, she won't back down because the odds are against her, or she has to do something personally unpleasant to see her will be done. That, my boy, is why we must approach her with extreme care. Theon nodded, following the logic. But still. Okay, I get that the stakes are high, but what's with the crazy lady practice? I'm pretty sure she isn't a psycho. Oberyn snorted alongside Tyrion, wig in one hand, a mug of grog in the other. This is because you were blessed by the gods with a mother like Cat and sisters like Sansa and Arya. Take it from me, I've known many women, even fathered several, and on a bad day, when the monthly flows are occurring, even my beloved Ellaria is less than angelic. Quite surprised I haven't woken up to her stabbing me, come to think of it. Tyrion nodded sagely. She was a dear, but sometimes he wanted to throttle her. We're practicing this to prepare you for the worst case scenarios. A woman's mood can be as fickle as the wind. And reports are all well and good, but until we meet this Daenerys Targaryen face to face, it's best to assume nothing about her, her character, her motivations. You must be ready to deal with a hormonal, possibly mad woman who will do almost anything to kill you, marry, both or something in between. It's just not prudent to expect smooth sailing, Theon. Murphy simply won't allow it. Theon took a moment to digest all that, sighed and put his shoes back on. This time, can I at least lead? Oh Theon, how positively manly of you. Oberyn gave Theon the most exaggerated eye flutter, which Theon just groaned at while Tyrion smirked and made notes. It was a long journey indeed.